we shall discuss Lorgar Aurelian, called the Urizen, or Wisest of the Wise, by the people of his homeworld of Colchis, the Golden One, the Great Evangelist of the Great Crusade, and Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion. First convert to Chaos, Daemon Primarch of Chaos Undivided, the self-appointed archpriest of the primordial truth and minister of Chaos Absolute, the Emperor's greatest failure. Lorgar Aurelian's fall to chaos represents more than just the corruption of a single Primarch. Rather, the failure of the Emperor's vision to address humanity's and his son's spiritual and emotional needs, writ small in the story of one person. His story is one of devotion turned to fanaticism, idealism perverted into nihilism, and love betrayed by silence and scorn. Let us begin with an outline of his character and story, setting the stage for deeper analysis. Lorgar's journey is fundamentally about faith, purpose, and belonging. The Emperor intended the Primarchs to be embodiments of specific virtues or tools of conquest. But Lorgar represents something deeper than the Emperor had intended. Humanity's need for meaning, connection, and a belief in something greater than oneself. This makes his fall both poignant and almost inevitable in the context of the Emperor's own shortcomings. Lorgar is the only Primarch whose essence is defined by faith. From his upbringing on Colchis, where religion shaped every part of life, to his time as a missionary of the imperial truth, Lorgar believed that humanity's greatness required a spiritual foundation. The Emperor's rejection of worship struck at the very core of Lorgar's identity. For Lorgar, worship was not weakness, it was acknowledgement of something greater, a collective bond that transcended individuals. His eventual embrace of chaos is thus not a betrayal of his nature, but a fulfillment of it, twisted though it may be. Chaos, in its boundless malleability and raw emotional appeal, gave Lorgar the sense of cosmic purpose the Emperor denied him. Lorgar's loyalty to what he believed the Emperor to have been was absolute, and his worship of the Emperor as a god was sincere. His legion, the Word-Bearers, were soldiers, but more importantly, they were pilgrims. They were preachers. When the Emperor censured Lorgar and the Word-Bearers at Monarchia, destroying the city Lorgar had dedicated to the Emperor, and forcing his legion to kneel in humiliation, it shattered Lorgar's faith. This was one of the Emperor's great mistakes, not recognizing that Lorgar's devotion, though misguided, was an untapped reservoir of strength and unity. Lorgar is unique among the Primarchs in his search for universal meaning. Where others found purpose in war or governance or the pursuit of knowledge, Lorgar sought to understand humanity's place in the cosmos. The Emperor denied him that, but chaos offered him that purpose. A universe where belief shapes reality, where gods walk among mortals, and where his gift for faith was not a flaw, but rather a strength. Let's go over the major phases of Lorgar's life before we talk about them in much more detail one at a time. Lorgar grew up on a deeply religious world, Colchis, steeped in the worship of chaos gods, though they were seen in various other guises. His mentor, Corpheron, indoctrinated Lorgar into religious zealotry, teaching him to revere faith and spiritual authority. His ascension as a prophet and ruler of Colchis was built on his ability to inspire and unify people through belief, a gift that would later define his rise and fall. Unlike some of his brothers, Lorgar immediately recognized the Emperor's majesty and divinity, or so he believed. He knelt in worship and dedicated his life to spreading the emperor's vision, though he interpreted the imperial truth as a spiritual doctrine rather than a purely secular one. The emperor, for his part, overlooked Lorgar's deep and obvious spiritual needs, viewing him as an ideal propagandist without fully understanding the foundation of his devotion, or indeed putting any effort at all into attempting to understand that devotion. During the Great Crusade, Monarchia was Lorgar's masterwork, a perfect city dedicated to the worship of the emperor. Its destruction by the Ultramarines under the emperor's command, the public humiliation of Lorgar and the Wordbearers, marked the turning point in his story. Here, Lorgar's faith in the emperor was shattered. For a man who had devoted himself utterly, this rejection was a wound deeper than any blade could inflict, and the emperor appears to have completely failed to understand just how deeply he wounded Lorgar. Guided by Corpheron and Erebus, two of the four worst people in the galaxy, Lorgar began to explore the primordial truth, the existence of the Chaos Gods as the true rulers of reality and unreality. Where the Emperor denied divinity, Chaos embraced it. Lorgar's pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror confirmed his belief that the Emperor was a false god, and that Chaos represented the ultimate truth. His faith, once directed toward unity and enlightenment, now became a weapon of division and corruption. Lorgar's role in the Horus Heresy, then, was pivotal. He was the first to turn to Chaos, and laid much of the groundwork for the rebellion, including orchestrating the events on Davin that led to Horus's corruption. He was part of the important trinity of Primarchs, without whom the Horus Heresy could not have gotten as far as it did. Alongside Perturabo and Horus, he was absolutely essential for the war effort. Unlike Angron or Fulgrim, who reveled in destruction, Lorgar saw the heresy as a holy war, a crusade to tear down the false emperor and install Chaos as the new order of the galaxy. His rivalry with Guilliman and the Ultramarines, then, who embodied the emperor's secular ideals, became a microcosm of the broader conflict. Ascending to daemonhood following the Horus Heresy was the culmination of Lorgar's journey. As the archpriest of Chaos Undivided, he became a figure of immense power and influence in the warp. However, in many ways, Lorgar's story ends here. Unlike many of the Daemon Primarchs, he has largely remained in the warp, spending millennia in contemplation, prayer, and self-imposed isolation, a meditative existence rather than an active existence. This withdrawal, then, raises questions about his true motivations, and about whether he might feel satisfaction or perhaps regret in his current state. There are several key themes we are going to explore throughout these many hours as I speak about him. Lorgar as a tragic figure is first and foremost. Is his fall entirely his fault? To what extent is it a consequence of the Emperor's failure to understand him? Could Lorgar have been saved with a different approach from the Emperor or from his brothers? What about Lorgar's legacy? The Word-Bearers remain one of the most influential traitor legions, the only remaining unified legion, spreading chaos worship across the galaxy. How does this legacy reflect Lorgar's original ideals, and how does it pervert them? What is the nature of the Legion being active and important, but their Primarch being passive? We shall need to consider theological and philosophical dimensions of his story, which invites comparison to real-world religious and philosophical figures. How does his journey mirror the dangers of real-world fanaticism, and what can we learn about our world through reading this fictional work. How did Lorgar's brothers view him, both before and after his fall? Were there any Primarchs who might have reached him or understood him? And what does Lorgar's retreat into the warp signify? Is he still an active player in the great game, or has he become disillusioned even with chaos? The overarching idea here is that Lorgar's fall to chaos underscores the dangers of ignoring emotional and spiritual needs, both in individuals and in societies. By exploring these themes, we can better understand Lorgar himself, the broader narrative of Warhammer 40,000, and the real world. As always, we must start at the beginning. Let us discuss Lorgar's early childhood. Upon landing on Colchis, Lorgar was found by a nomadic tribe of outcasts called the Declined, who existed outside the chaos-influenced faith of the Covenant, the main theocratic government on Colchis. He lived with the Declined for only 17 days, so they had no opportunity to substantially shape his personality or outlook. Let us first consider two primary outcomes. That's not the right word. Two primary options. There we go. What if he had stayed with the people of the Declined until adulthood, existing outside of the main population, outside the main society of Colchis, like how Jagatai Khan grew up with nomads far from the population centers of Chogoris? And then, as another option, certain Primarchs were shaped by two different cultures on their homeworlds. Examples include Mortarion, whose first culture was Xenos, Leman Russ, whose first culture was Animal, and then Ferris Manus, Lionel Johnson, and Conrad Kors, for whom their first culture was that of solitude, away from humanity. What if Lorgar had been raised by the Declined for the first portion of his life, and then afterwards spent time in the Covenant or with Corpheron? I think that Lorgar's brief time with the Declined represents an interesting what-if moment in his life, and exploring how an extended or dual upbringing might have shaped him offers some fascinating possibilities. The Declined and the Covenant represent two very different cultural influences, one rejecting the dominant chaos-influenced religious structures of Colchis, and the other fully embodying them. If Lorgar had been able to stay with the Declined until adulthood, he would have grown up in a culture fundamentally opposed to the dominant society of Colchis. Unlike Jagatai Khan's nomadic upbringing on Chogoris, which still celebrated strength and conquest, the Declined existed as marginalized outcasts, refugees defined by their rejection of the Covenant's authoritarian theocracy. The Declined lived in isolation, surviving on the fringes of society and rejecting the Covenant's devotion to chaos. Their existence was harsh, and had he lived among them, it would have forced Lorgar to develop resilience and self-reliance, as well as a sense of obligation to community, to help other people survive when he was the only one who might be able to help them. Their ideological rejection of the dominant culture would likely have instilled in Lorgar an independent, critical mind, questioning authority and societal norms. And unlike the Covenant, who exalted faith as a tool of control, the Declined might have fostered a more individualistic worldview. Without the Covenant's influence, Lorgar's innate capacity for faith and spirituality would have taken a very different shape. Instead of channeling it into organized religion, perhaps he might have sought meaning through philosophy, personal enlightenment, or a personal theology, or maybe even rebellion against the very idea of gods, seeking a broader, less understandable worldview, something more diffuse. We might call it Eastern, maybe. Lorgar's deep need for purpose and belonging could have been redirected towards protecting and uniting the Declined, rather than converting them to his own belief system. This could have given him a strong sense of grounded, practical leadership, akin to Jagatai's care for his various nomadic tribes. How might Lorgar's inherent need for universal meaning and order have clashed with the Decline's fragmented, survival-focused refugee lifestyle. There's a possibility for internal conflict there as well. Raised outside the bonds of Colchis' mainstream society, perhaps Lorgar could have become an isolationist leader, seeking to build a safe haven for the declined rather than attempting to reform or conquer the larger world. Perhaps this would have led him to embrace the emperor as a liberator and protector rather than as an object of worship. Without exposure to the Covenant's explicitly religious zeal, perhaps Lorgar might have pursued a more philosophical path, becoming a seeker of wisdom rather than a prophet of faith. This might have made him a unifying figure for humanity, advocating for a secular moral framework for the Imperium. If Lorgar had spent some time with the declined first, and then later with the Covenant or Corpheron, Lorgar would be spending his formative years with the declined before learning a new culture later in life, thus introducing a dynamic tension between two opposing influences in his development. During his early years, Lorgar would have been shaped by the decline's rejection of the Covenant's authoritarian control and religious dogma. This would instill in him a sense of skepticism towards organized power, and perhaps a distrust of hierarchical, theocratic structures. Living among refugees would have fostered empathy for the downtrodden and a desire to protect those who are marginalized or oppressed. Being introduced to the Covenant later in life would expose Lorgar to their deeply hierarchical, religiously devout society. Corpheron's influence, in particular, could be seen to reignite Lorgar's natural affinity for faith and order, but perhaps in a more extreme form as a switchback due to his upbringing among the declined. The tension between his early life and the Covenant's later indoctrination might manifest in Lorgar as a deep inner conflict, a struggle between his innate empathy for the oppressed and his learned belief in the necessity of faith and hierarchy. It's likely that this would make him question the motives and practices of the Covenant, leading him to reform their doctrines rather than blindly accept them. Such a dual upbringing might have created a more balanced Lorgar, one who could reconcile the need for spiritual meaning with the dangers of blind fanaticism. Perhaps he could have become a reformer rather than a zealot, reshaping the Covenant into a more compassionate and less oppressive institution, rather than purging it with fire and blade. Whether that's a good thing or not is hard to tell, though it's also worth noting that the clash between the declined's rejection of faith, or at least rejection of organized faith, and the Covenant's overwhelming hierarchical theocracy could have exacerbated Lorgar's insecurities and need for validation, making him perhaps even more vulnerable to manipulation by Corpheron. With empathy instilled by the declined and faith reignited by the Covenant, perhaps Lorgar might have become a unifying figure, blending spiritual enlightenment with a focus on protecting the vulnerable. His legion, then, could have been a force for moral guidance rather than fanaticism. The competing influences of his upbringing might have left Lorgar deeply conflicted, torn between his desire for spiritual meaning and his fear of repeating the Covenant's oppressive practices. This, then, could lead to indecision or instability, making him a tragic figure even if he ultimately remained loyal to the Emperor. In canon, Lorgar's early exposure to Corpheron shaped him into a deeply religious and fanatical individual, and it made him quite vulnerable to rejection and manipulation. Each of these alternate scenarios would have significantly altered his trajectory, either leading him to develop a more skeptical, grounded worldview, which would potentially make him less susceptible to chaos, or by tempering his fanaticism and amplifying his internal conflict, requiring him to reconcile competing influences in his life. Who the fuck knows what that would have done? Ultimately, these alternate scenarios highlight how much of Lorgar's tragedy stems from the cultural and ideological forces that shaped him, most especially embodied in the physical and emotional abuse from Cor Phaeron. The Emperor's failure to recognize and address these influences sealed Lorgar's fate. But with a different foundation, Lorgar might have become one of the Imperium's greatest leaders. When Lorgar was 17 days old, Cor Phaeron found him and found the Declined, saw immense potential in Lorgar, and then took him for himself by slaughtering the Declined. This sets the stage for the rest of Lorgar's life. Exploitation, indoctrination, manipulation, and violence dominate Lorgar's story. Cor Phaeron's decision to take Lorgar, not as a person to nurture, but as a tool to shape, reveals immediately his predatory nature. Cor Phaeron recognized Lorgar's immense potential, his charisma, intelligence, spiritual inclination, and chose to wield these qualities for one purpose: more power for Cor Phaeron. This set the tone for how Lorgar would be treated by authority figures throughout his life, as a means to an end rather than an individual with his own emotional needs. By slaughtering the Declined, Cor Phaeron erased the only culture that could have given Lorgar a different path, one rooted in rejection of authoritarianism and blind faith. This act severed Lorgar from a potential alternative to the Covenant's dogmatic structure, ensuring that his worldview would be shaped entirely by Cor Phaeron's influence. This echoes the Imperium's later treatment of cultures it deems heretical, erasing them to impose its own ideology. Lorgar's exposure to violence and betrayal at such a young age left him with a lasting psychological impact. Though he was perhaps too young to consciously remember the slaughter of the Declined, though this is tough to say because the Primarchs had precocious memory, this event planted the seeds of a deep subconscious insecurity. The idea that those who care for him can be taken away, and that survival requires submission to a stronger power. Cor Phaeron's actions were, of course, deeply hypocritical, as he claimed to serve his faith while committing an atrocity that violated anyone's moral tenets. This hypocrisy mirrors Lorgar's later disillusionment with the Emperor, whom he initially revered, but came to see as a figure of betrayal and inconsistency. Cor Phaeron's domination of Lorgar created a psychological dependency that persisted throughout his life. Lorgar's need for guidance, validation, and purpose made him vulnerable to manipulation by Cor Phaeron, the Emperor, and ultimately by Chaos. Each of these figures became a surrogate for the family he lost when Cor Phaeron slaughtered the Declined. The Covenant's faith, as instilled by Cor Phaeron, taught Lorgar that submission to a higher power was not only necessary but virtuous. This belief became the cornerstone of Lorgar's personality, leading him to revere the Emperor as a god, and later to embrace Chaos when the Emperor rejected his worship. Cor Phaeron's betrayal of the Declined established a pattern in Lorgar's life. Those he trusted most would betray him, and he would betray others in turn. This cycle is seen in his relationship with the Emperor seeming to betray Lorgar by rejecting Lorgar's worship of him, his role in the Horus Heresy with Lorgar betraying the Emperor, and his eventual service to Chaos betraying humanity itself. Cor Phaeron's influence was so pervasive, his hooks were so deep in Lorgar, that even becoming a Primarch and achieving immense power, Lorgar remained unable to escape his foster father's shadow. Cor Phaeron's continued presence in the Wordbearers ensured that Lorgar's insecurities and need for approval were constantly reinforced, keeping him emotionally stunted and dependent. If Cor Phaeron had not successfully slaughtered the declined, they might have provided Lorgar with an alternative moral and cultural foundation. Again, their life as refugees, their rejection of the Covenant's dogma, could have fostered in Lorgar a more independent and critical mindset, allowing him to approach faith and power with greater nuance. This would have significantly altered his trajectory, perhaps even preventing his eventual fall to chaos. Being raised among the declined, Lorgar might have developed a faith rooted in compassion, humility, and resistance to authoritarianism, rather than in submission and zealotry. With a strong moral foundation from the declined, Lorgar might have thus been less susceptible to Corpheron's indoctrination and the Covenant's oppressive structures. Living as an outcast, as a refugee, might have deepened Lorgar's empathy for those on the margins of society, making him a champion of the downtrodden rather than a servant of chaos. Corpheron's slaughter of the declined foreshadows Lorgar's own later actions as a leader. Just as Corpheron erased the declined to mold Lorgar in his image, Lorgar would later demand absolute conformity from his followers and from the planets they conquered, erasing individuality in service to his vision, first of what he believed to be the imperial truth, and then later his vision of the worship of chaos. This parallel underscores the tragic cycle of abuse and control that defined Lorgar's life. For his immense impact on Lorgar, Corpheron is one of the few dozen most important figures in 40K, and so deserves some attention. Corpheron lived in a nomadic caravan of outcasts from the Covenant. Corpheron had specifically been exiled from the capital city and main organization of the Covenant because he advocated for more forceful, violent, and aggressive conversion methods. He was an outcast from a chaos-influenced major religion because he was too extreme even for them. Corpheron's exile from the Covenant is a significant event that paints him as an outsider even within a society already shaped by religious zealotry. His desires for forceful, violent methods show us a deep belief in the necessity of dominance and control. This was too far even for the Covenant, whose traditional methods were still coercive, but were at least more, we might say, subtle or politically cautious. Corpheron's belief in violent imposition of religious ideals in order to bring more personal power to him, Corpheron, can be understood as the root of much of Lorgar's later zealotry. Corpheron's belief that the spread of faith could only be achieved through extreme methods, violence, domination, unrelenting force, foreshadows Lorgar's own later belief in the absolute necessity of spreading the imperial truth, or later chaos, by any means necessary. Corpheron's influence on Lorgar, as the latter grows into his role as the evangelist, is key. Where the Emperor believed in the power of human reason and voluntary unity, Lorgar, shaped by Corpheron, viewed faith and belief as things to be violently imposed on others. Corpheron's actions, his use of violence casually, reveals that his belief in the gods of the Covenant, his later service to chaos, all of it was secondary to his desire for personal power. By taking Lorgar in, Corpheron ensured that the young Primarch would be conditioned by his worldview and usable as a tool. He taught Lorgar that faith was not about personal conviction or voluntary belief, but was imposed as a form of control and authority. This created a paradox. Lorgar's eventual mission initially centered on unity and salvation during the Great Crusade, became twisted into a crusade of domination through force, what we might see from our perspective in the real world as colonialism. It's also worth noting that Corpheron's exile from the Covenant can be viewed as an act of self-justification. Exile meant that he could hold on to his extreme beliefs without any moderation or reflection from his former society. His failure to integrate into the Covenant's mainstream reinforced his ideology and hardened his view that the world was inherently flawed for not accepting him, requiring his own violent methods of salvation. This internal conviction would later be passed down to Lorgar, as Corpheron became the de facto father figure in the Primarch's life. Lorgar inherited Corpheron's worldview, his belief that faith and power were derived from the imposition of authority through violence, something Lorgar saw as necessary both when spreading the word of the Emperor in the Great Crusade and afterwards, after the Emperor rejected his worship and he turned to chaos. To Corpheron and then later to Lorgar, religion was a tool for control, a means of bending others to one's will. This attitude pervaded Corpheron's life and shaped how he raised Lorgar, teaching him that submission and domination were the ultimate expressions of faith. The faithful submitted to the powerful, and the faithful converted through domination. Corpheron's influence on Lorgar cannot be overstated. His worldview was that faith is submission to a higher power, and that leadership is domination over others through violence. This was not about spreading faith for the benefit of others. It was about forcing submission as a demonstration of his own, Corpheron's own, strength and superiority. From the moment Corpheron took Lorgar from the declined, he began shaping Lorgar's view of the world. And to Lorgar, faith became the ultimate form of submission, and leadership became a sacred duty to impose truth upon the masses through violence. By taking Lorgar from the declined and slaughtering them, Corpheron ensured that he was the only source of stability, guidance, and affection, such as it was, in Lorgar's life. This created an emotional dependency that persisted into adulthood, with Corpheron continuing to manipulate Lorgar even after he became a Primarch. While Corpheron saw himself as a mentor and father to Lorgar, he was, in fact, an abusive manipulator, a monster in the skin of a human. He controlled Lorgar's belief system and worldview with an iron grip, ensuring that Lorgar grew up completely dependent on him. Lorgar's reverence for Corpheron as a father figure blinded him to the unhealthy dynamic they shared, where Lorgar's own spiritual growth was continually shaped by Corpheron's manipulation. Corpheron's view of faith as a means of imposing control was then put into action on Colchis, and then later in the Great Crusade, when Lorgar began spreading the belief in the Emperor as a god, and then later as emperors spread the word of chaos. By emphasizing forceful, unyielding belief, Corpheron laid the groundwork for Lorgar's later disillusionment with the Emperor, whose refusal to embrace his divinity was seen by Lorgar as a betrayal. This further fueled Lorgar's eventual fall to chaos, where he would find a path to godhood, albeit through the corrupting embrace of the primordial annihilator. The tension between Corpheron and Lorgar mirrors in some ways the toxic father-son dynamic of Necare and Mortarion. Corpheron, though manipulative and emotionally and physically abusive, was perhaps less openly monstrous than Necare, and was also a source of emotional and intellectual validation for Lorgar in some ways. His teachings became Lorgar's guiding light, though they were ultimately warped and misguided. Just as the Emperor's rejection and emotional neglect of the Primarchs shaped their fall to chaos, Corpheron's own influence left Lorgar very vulnerable to the promises of power and transcendence and purpose offered by the Chaos Gods. When Corpheron found Lorgar, he saw the potential in him to be a tool, a future weapon of faith, power, and influence. He molded Lorgar in his own image, passing on his violent, unyielding vision of religious conquest. The lessons he imparted to Lorgar were rooted in a complete absence of compassion and empathy. Corpheron believed that the ends justified the means, and his treatment of Lorgar would reflect that. This dynamic would define their relationship and be instrumental in Lorgar's later actions. By raising Lorgar in an environment where harshness and radical views were normalized, Corpheron essentially trained Lorgar to embrace violence and oppression in the name of his faith. While Lorgar may have initially sought a path that emphasized spiritual elevation, Corpheron's teachings skewed that path, pushing him towards belief in absolute power and religious dominance imposed by violence. This is evident in Lorgar's leadership of his legion, his willingness to worship the Emperor, and then his fall to chaos when he felt abandoned. Corpheron's teachings told Lorgar that his path to transcendence lay in total and absolute faith, submitting to a higher power, unchallenged by reason, and unwilling to embrace empathy for those who are the victims of one's own violence. Corpheron's influence on Lorgar reflects a deeper danger in mentorship, the power imbalance between the mentor and the student. Corpheron's overwhelming influence over Lorgar limited the opportunity for Lorgar to develop his own identity or moral code, free from external pressures. Lorgar would internalize Corpheron's teachings and reinforce them throughout his later life, including his fall to chaos. The trauma of Lorgar's early life under Corpheron's heavy-handed methods would ensure that his emotional needs were never truly met. Rather than seeking empathy or personal growth, Lorgar would channel his energy into blind devotion to the Emperor and later to chaos, as a way of compensating for the emptiness he felt inside. Corpheron's unyielding devotion to his vision of religious conquest and purity would also play a pivotal role in Lorgar's later decisions to spread faith at all costs, even when they led to war, death, and destruction. Corpheron did not view religious faith as something that nurtures the spirit. He viewed it as a weapon. It was a means of control and subjugation. This made it easier for Lorgar to embrace the idea of using the imperial truth, and later chaos, as tools of oppression, conquest through violence. Lorgar failed to see that the very concept of faith is often corrupted by the need for control by those in power. Corpheron's teachings erased any distinction between faith as a spiritual act and faith as a tool of domination. In keeping with Corpheron's extremism, Lorgar was cut off from humanity in a meaningful way. His early life in The Declined was robbed of its potential to shape him into someone who could understand the human condition. The trauma of his early relationship with Corpheron left him disconnected from the essential qualities of empathy, compassion, and connection. The constant pushing for submission to his god, or any god, left Lorgar unable to see the inherent dignity and potential of humanity. He rejected the idea that humans could find transcendence through their own efforts, and instead insisted that their path to salvation would always be dependent on submitting to a higher power. Initially taught as the Emperor, and later teaching that it would be the gods of chaos. When Corpheron eventually helped Lorgar to turn the Word-Bearers' legion. His influence thus continued to be felt. The Word-Bearers' overwhelming devotion to their belief in the Emperor's divinity was directly from Corpheron's efforts to convert them. Corpheron's teachings on the need for absolute submission and devotion to an ultimate power contributed to the Word-Bearers' inability to accept the Emperor's later rejection, and thus to their eventual rebellion. Corpheron shaped Lorgar's legion into religious zealots who believed in the necessity of spreading their faith through violence. Their obsessive mission to turn the galaxy to worship of the Emperor, and then, later, chaos, was a direct result of Corpheron's extremism. The Word-Bearers' rigid faith, even when it led to their fall, reflects Corpheron's belief that true salvation was only possible through violent, forceful imposition of belief. It was his manipulation that led Lorgar to then become a God King in the name of the Chaos Gods, and his absence from the Emperor's service would ultimately culminate in the downfall of the Imperium, both literally and thematically. Corpheron's exile was not just from the Covenant's structures, but also from faith itself in many ways. Being too extreme for even such a radical, chaos-tainted religion showed that Corpheron's vision of what was needed to bring humanity under one unified faith was authoritarian and fanatical. This is directly relevant to Lorgar's development, as he would take Corpheron's teachings and ideology and translate them into the creation of the Word-Bearers as a force for conversion through violence and intimidation. This act of forceful conversion on planet after planet during the Great Crusade was exactly in line with the methods that Corpheron had initially advocated for on Colchis. His role as a teacher, mentor, and paternal figure to Lorgar was grounded in violent and authoritarian ideals, placing Corpheron in the position of the one who did violence and the one who had authority. Corpheron's views on how to deal with religious dissent and conversion reflect his obsession with control. This mentality aligns with the later tendencies of the Word-Bearers to force others to see the truth of their vision through subjugation and violence. Corpheron had an unyielding belief in the righteousness of his views and saw no room for compromise. The fact that his views were seen as dangerous even by the Covenant's leadership shows how extreme he was and how deep-rooted that extremism would be when he mentored Lorgar. Corpheron's early embrace of Lorgar as a tool and his influence over the Legion as the first captain of the Word-Bearers made him the pivotal figure in the Legion's corruption. His alignment with Chaos predated Lorgar's own conversion by many decades, and he acted as a bridge between his original beliefs from the Covenant and the primordial truth of Chaos Undivided, able to transfer the worship and faith of the Word-Bearers from a place of complete despair after being rejected by the Emperor to a place of complete fanaticism to a new target. Corpheron's consistent prioritization throughout his entire life of his own personal power over any principles at all shows the manipulative nature of chaos itself. That's why he became an agent of chaos long before the Word-Bearers fell. Corpheron represents several thematic ideas which are central to Warhammer 40,000. Faith corrupted by ambition. He is a cautionary tale about the dangers of using faith as a means of control rather than as a path to enlightenment. His belief in any sort of gods is hollow, driven by ego and a thirst for personal power rather than by any conviction. This reflects the corrupting influence of chaos and, indeed, the corrupting influence of searching for power. His treatment of Lorgar perpetuates a cycle of abuse, with Lorgar internalizing Corpheron's lessons and applying them on a galactic scale. Corpheron's manipulation of Lorgar mirrors how chaos manipulates its followers, offering power while fostering dependency and corruption. Corpheron serves as a dark mirror to the Emperor. Both figures shaped Lorgar's development, but where the Emperor dismissed Lorgar's emotional needs and sought to suppress his faith, Corpheron exploited those needs and encouraged his faith in the form of submission in order to create a zealous servant of Corpheron's goals. This contrast highlights the tragedy of Lorgar's fall, as both of his father figures failed him in different ways, but they did both fail him. And so overall, Corpheron's role in Lorgar's life is a catalyst for his eventual fall to chaos, and a tragic reflection of how Lorgar's deep need for belief and guidance was never met. He never had any sort of healthy, sustainable source of belief. He never had any sort of healthy mentorship, nothing. Instead of fostering Lorgar's spiritual and emotional growth, Corpheron imposed his radical views on Lorgar, trapping Lorgar in a cycle of blind submission to authority, power, and dogma. Would Lorgar have turned out differently had Corpheron not slaughtered the Declined and taken him in? Would he have been able to reject the gods of chaos and embrace a different path? These questions remain speculative, and I encourage you to make your own videos about them. But what is clear is that Corpheron's abuse and influence ensured that Lorgar's destiny would be a tragic one, forever intertwining faith and power beyond reason with submission to the worst person in the galaxy. That's maybe overstating things. Corpheron is legitimately top 4. What if Corpheron had been absent? If Corpheron had never found Lorgar, his life could have taken any number of very different paths. Raised among the Declined, Lorgar might have developed a more independent and compassionate worldview. Without Corpheron's manipulative influence, he might have become a philosopher or reformer, uniting cultures through reason and empathy rather than dogma and massive warfare. Perhaps Lorgar could have confronted the Covenant as an outsider, challenging its dogma with a more enlightened form of spirituality or philosophy. And without Corpheron's influence throughout his life, Lorgar would have certainly been less susceptible to chaos, even if Erebus was still around. He would have viewed chaos as just another form of oppressive control, rather than a source of ultimate truth. During the Great Crusade, Lorgar's charisma and insight into spirituality and a need for purpose could have been channeled into unifying humanity without falling into religious zealotry, potentially making him the most influential of the Primarchs. As a father figure for Lorgar, Corpheron relied on unrelenting, violent physical abuse, emotional abuse, and indoctrination. He is probably the second worst father figure among the Primarch's early lives, just behind Necare, the adoptive father of Mortarion on Barbarous. Corpheron stands out almost uniquely in his complete absence of genuine care or altruism for anyone else. His parenting was entirely self-serving, designed to make Lorgar into a pliable tool for his own ambitions, and ensured that Lorgar was shaped by trauma and a deeply ingrained sense of submission and dependence. Corpheron's violence, his physical abuse, ensured that fear was the foundation of Lorgar's upbringing. Now, while Necare on Barbarous used physical suffering as a test of survival, Corpheron's violence served no purpose other than to dominate and control Lorgar. It was not discipline or teaching, it was a perverse assertion of his authority, breaking down Lorgar's sense of independence. In addition to physical abuse, there is also emotional abuse. Corpheron created an environment of constant belittlement, undermining Lorgar's self-worth, while making him dependent on Corpheron for approval. This dynamic ensured that Lorgar's self-identity revolved around pleasing his abuser, a trait that persisted into adulthood and manifested in his need for external validation of his beliefs. Corpheron exploited Lorgar's natural inclination towards spirituality by warping it into a fanatical devotion to the gods of the Covenant. Rather than nurturing Lorgar's intellectual curiosity or moral philosophy, he forced dogma upon him, creating a worldview where submission and obedience were seen as virtues. This indoctrination laid the groundwork for Lorgar's later susceptibility to chaos. By slaughtering the declined and working to isolate Lorgar among the convoy, Corpheron tried to make sure that Lorgar had no alternative influences or alternate support systems, thus deepening Lorgar's dependency. The role of an abuser is to become the sole source of guidance and support, especially when that guidance is cruel and exploitative. Damokos, father of Perturabo on Olympia, was the third worst, Corpheron second, and Necare first worst of the father figures. They represent extreme examples of abusive father figures, but their methods and motivations differ. Let's take a look at Necare more specifically. His abuse was rooted in his alien perspective and a twisted sense of survivalism, while Corpheron's abuse was entirely human in its cruelty, a calculated means of shaping someone else into a tool to serve one's own power. Thus why, even as an adult, Lorgar remained emotionally tethered to Corpheron, allowing Corpheron to remain an influential figure within the Word-Bearers. This dependency is later mirrored in his later relationship with Chaos, as he submitted to the so-called primordial truth of Chaos in much the same way that he submitted to Corpheron's authority. Meanwhile, we can see that Necare was trying to make Mortarion into his heir. He wanted to make Mortarion like himself, powerful, resilient, cruel. But Mortarion was able to choose to leave. Corpheron, meanwhile, made sure that Lorgar would not make that choice. His role as a father figure is a failure on every level. He took a child with extraordinary potential and shaped him into a tool for his own ambitions. Lorgar's later fall to Chaos, then, is a reflection of the environment that Corpheron created, which pushed him towards making certain choices because of his life which was defined by abuse, indoctrination, and manipulation. Other Primarchs were able to overcome their abusive or alien upbringings, but Lorgar's scars ran too deep because they were tied to his most fundamental beliefs. Could he have chosen otherwise? Yes, everyone always has a choice, but it would have been very difficult for him. Now, I will say, Corpheron was not the only source of upbringing for Lorgar. While Corpheron's abuse and indoctrination were key features shaping Lorgar's early life, while Corpheron dominated him entirely throughout his early life, the context in which they lived was not an isolated one. Their environment provides a more nuanced picture of his upbringing. Because they weren't isolated in an island somewhere, they depended on other people for survival as part of a nomadic caravan. This nomadic caravan they traveled with was not merely a vehicle for Corpheron's wanderings, it was also a rich source of learning and culture. It was a group of highly educated refugees who had left or fled the Covenant for a variety of reasons, and who were thus happy to share their various teachings and literature with the precocious Golden Child. They metaphorically shoveled gigantic stacks of holy books into the bottomless furnace that was Lorgar's mind. He showed throughout this period his irrepressible love of learning, offering him opportunities to grow in ways that even Corpheron could not entirely suppress. And so, despite Corpheron doing his best to beat Lorgar into submission and monopolize his access to information and isolate him from others, Lorgar used the culture and context of his environment available to him, the people he could speak with and the books he could read, to form his own theology. He was able to do this because the caravan was populated by exiles and outcasts who had left the Covenant for a variety of intellectual, spiritual, or ideological reasons, who were not unthinking zealots. They had a deep understanding of theology, philosophy, and history, and they had chosen to walk away from the Covenant's orthodoxy. Thus, they wanted to share what they had to offer, and this gave Lorgar exposure to a wide range of interpretations, beliefs, and ideas which the rigid Covenant could not and would not offer. While Corpheron sought to shape Lorgar's mind to his own ends, the broader caravan tried to expose him to a more pluralistic intellectual environment so that he could grow into being his own person. Lorgar's insatiable hunger for knowledge led him to devour the teachings and the literature available to him, whether they aligned with Corpheron's beliefs or not. Lorgar's capacity to absorb and synthesize information is one of his greatest defining traits. So no matter how much Lorgar was limited by Corpheron, the caravan was still able to provide him with endless material with which to stoke his intellectual fire. Thus, even under Corpheron's domination, Lorgar began to form his own theological interpretations. As such, Lorgar ended up making his own theological framework distinct from both the Covenant's orthodoxy and Corpheron's extremist interpretations. By drawing upon the diversity of thought within the caravan, he began to construct a worldview that sought to unify disparate strands of belief into a single coherent vision. This is a great and noble enterprise, and we can see here early signs of Lorgar's obsession with finding ultimate universal truth. He did his darn best, I'll tell you. But because his intellectual development outpaced his moral development, as his moral development was stunted by the abuse he suffered at the hands of Corpheron, he kept running into the problem that he would think, there is an ultimate universal truth that's out there, and I can figure it out. And then someone steps in who's impressive to him, and he's like, oh, it's morally right to submit to someone more powerful. This individual or this group of chaos parasites is the ultimate truth. And that's just bad. It's bad. It's bad. There's no way around it. He could have very well met the Emperor and met the Chaos Gods and gone, wow, none of you are it. None of you. And that would have been the mature thing to do. Anyway, back to Corpheron. Ever the controlling figure, he sought to isolate Lorgar intellectually and spiritually, and so he viewed the caravan's diversity of thought as a threat to his authority. He worked to suppress any ideas that deviated from his dogma, and he worked to isolate Lorgar from any sources of support which would make him less dependent on Corpheron. He's just the classic abuser. He uses physical abuse, emotional abuse, indoctrination, and isolation to try to make Lorgar submissive to his own worldview and malleable as a tool for his own ends. If any of you out there notice that a person in your life or a group of people, perhaps in a church that you're a part of, work to try to get you to spend less time with people outside of their direct control, you should be worried. You should talk to a therapist about that, especially if they tell you not to see a therapist. Anyway, back to Lorgar. Reminder, the caravan's teachings gave Lorgar the tools to construct a theology, but Corpheron's abuse ensured that his theology was rooted in submission. This combination of intellectual rigor and emotional neediness made Lorgar a good candidate for chaos later, because the gods of chaos offered him the validation and ultimate truth he craved, while at the same time the gods of chaos declined to actually live up to their ideals. They could not choose otherwise. Thus, the primordial truth of chaos was in many ways the culmination of Lorgar's childhood quest to reconcile the myriad beliefs he encountered in his life, and a recognition of his childishness at submitting to the father figure. Lorgar's love of learning and his intellectual curiosity were fostered in this early part of his life, and these foundational traits would drive his actions throughout his life, but so would the flaws which he carried with him from the horrible abuse which he had suffered. The caravan thus offered Lorgar, and offers us, a glimpse of what Lorgar might have been, an independent thinker and theologian, but it was ultimately overshadowed by Corpheron's successful attempts to monopolize influence over Lorgar and isolate him from others. Thus, Lorgar's interest in diversity of thought and learning was twisted into a tool for Corpheron's zealotry. There we go. Had Lorgar been raised in this caravan environment without the shadow of Corpheron's abuse, he might very well have become a philosopher king rather than the archpriest of chaos. Now, if the first great turning point in Lorgar's life was Corpheron murdering his first family, the Declined, the second great turning point takes place among the caravan. After Lorgar developed his own personal theology, the physical abuse perpetrated by Corpheron against Lorgar intensified, as Corpheron tried to reassert control over Lorgar and erase what he thought of as Lorgar's heresy. Corpheron was highly motivated, as he still planned to use him as a weapon against his political enemies within the Covenant in order to amass power. When the members of the caravan could not stand the continued abuse of Lorgar any longer, some of them attempted to mutiny against Corpheron. If they had succeeded, Lorgar's life and the trajectory of the Imperium overall may have been changed drastically. Instead, Lorgar stepped in to save his abusive foster father due to a misplaced sense of loyalty and undeserved filial love. Think of it kind of like the end of Tangled, when the foster mother who had kidnapped her is falling out the window and she tries to save her anyway. This twisted love for one's abuser encapsulates the deep tragedy of Lorgar's early years. His choice to save Corpheron from the mutiny, despite the overwhelming evidence of his abuse, sealed his fate and laid the foundation for his later devotion to other abusive and manipulative powers, the Emperor, and later the gods of chaos. The mutineers were the intellectual and moral heart of the caravan, people who saw Lorgar's potential and wanted to protect him from further harm. They believed that, free from Corpheron's control, this child could flourish as a scholar and theologian, untainted by his foster father's violent and power-hungry influence. The mutiny shows us that Corpheron's rule was unpopular even beyond his treatment of Lorgar. The caravan saw him accurately as a tyrant. This is reasonable. But despite enduring years of unjust abuse, Lorgar could not bring himself to abandon Corpheron. His intervention to save his foster father, rooted in a deep and misplaced filial love, represents the emotional scars that abuse leaves on the abused. Lorgar's actions can be seen as stemming from a desperate desire to earn Corpheron's approval, no matter how unattainable that was, and no matter how abusive he was. Corpheron's victory over the mutineers, made possible only by Lorgar's intervention, strengthened his control over the caravan and over Lorgar himself. Corpheron thus used this moment to solidify his authority by punishing the mutineers harshly as an example to others. By intervening on Corpheron's behalf, Lorgar inadvertently deepened his dependence on his abuser. Corpheron could now frame the mutiny as evidence of the world's hostility, and reinforce the idea that only he, Corpheron, truly cared for Lorgar. If the mutiny had succeeded, Lorgar's life, and by extension the fate of the Imperium, would have followed a very different path. Without Corpheron's abusive influence, Lorgar could have been able to develop into a vastly different person. The absence of Corpheron's emotional abuse might have allowed Lorgar to develop greater emotional resilience and a more balanced worldview, thus making him less susceptible to the predations of chaos. If the mutineers had succeeded, they might have taken Lorgar under their wing, guiding him with care and compassion, with the learned members of the caravan mentoring Lorgar and fostering his love of learning, helping him to explore his own theological ideas in a supportive environment rather than an abusive one. Being encouraged to think independently and value diversity of thought might have thus steered Lorgar away from the dogmatic mindset that defined his later actions. This was not to be. Lorgar's decision to save Corpheron during the mutiny, perhaps the most poignant moment of his early life, reveals the depths of his emotional wounds and the extent to which Corpheron had manipulated him. His misplaced loyalty and love cost Lorgar his chance at freedom and ensured that Corpheron would remain a destructive force in his life, shaping his path towards chaos. His inability to break free from this toxic relationship speaks to the profound psychological impact of his upbringing. Could he have chosen otherwise? Yes, certainly. But it would have been very difficult. Lorgar's choice to save Corpheron thus mirrors his later actions during the Horus Heresy, where he threw his loyalty in with the Chaos Gods, despite their clear exploitation of him. In each case, Lorgar's misplaced loyalty, yearning for approval, and fear of what his life would be like without a clear father figure led him down a path of destruction. Ultimately, it would have been very difficult for Lorgar to have made a different decision during the mutiny without outside help, and Corpheron had done his best to isolate him from any sources of outside help or guidance. Lorgar's primary theological idea at this time was that the polytheism of his homeworld was a shadow of a deeper monotheistic reality. That if the four great powers were real, that they were somehow subservient entities, or perhaps mere facets of a supreme divine being. This is an idea which has come up a few times here and there in human religion. Let us discuss specifically the monotheism of Xenophanes of Colophon, who was born 570 BCE and died 475 BCE. Xenophanes was an ancient Greek philosopher and poet who challenged the traditional polytheistic views of his time, proposing a form of monotheism which is strikingly similar to Lorgar's early theological ideas. His thoughts are fragmentary and largely preserved through later writers, unfortunately, but they offer a radical vision of a single supreme divine being that transcends the, let's call them anthropomorphic gods of the Greek pantheon. He criticized the Greek portrayal of gods as being human-like figures with all too human flaws: greed, jealousy, deception, violence. In response, he proposed a vision of the divine that was fundamentally different from the Homeric and Hesiodic traditions. Xenophanes asserted that one God, greatest among gods and men, neither in form nor thought like mortals, rules over all things. He specifically ridiculed the idea that the polytheistic gods of his culture were just like people, but with more power. The gods of Olympus are depicted as quarrelsome and limited beings. Unlike them, Xenophanes' idea of God was an all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing being who might be fundamentally different from humans. He suggested that the gods of polytheistic tradition, if they existed, might simply be different names for some sort of single divine principle. This idea rhymes with Lorgar's belief that the gods of chaos were merely shadows of a greater unified divine reality. Xenophanes described his god as one who does not move, for he does not need to, for his will alone shapes reality. This contrasts sharply with the capricious, warring gods of mythology, but aligns well with the concept of a supreme cosmic order. Lorgar's early theological ideas seem to have mirrored this, picturing a divine force which manifests through reality itself. Xenophanes mocked the idea that gods had human-like forms and personalities, pointing out that different cultures shape their gods in their own image. He joked that if horses had gods, they would resemble horses, and if oxen had gods, they would resemble oxen. He argued that whatever one true god there was would likely not resemble any particular species or have mortal characteristics at all. This suggests a conception of divinity more in line with an abstract principle rather than personal deities. Now, Lorgar, born something like 30,000 years after Xenophanes' death, likely never read Xenophanes. But his early theological ideas bear an uncanny resemblance to this ancient Greek philosopher's monotheistic vision, perhaps indicating that the writers for 40K were familiar with the concept in 1980s Britain. They were each religious reformers, just as Xenophanes sought to reform the Greek religious mindset, rejecting polytheistic idolatry in favor of a singular divine reality. Lorgar sought to reform the Covenant's theology by showing their gods to be something like aspects of a higher truth. Both of them were deeply frustrated by the ignorance of the masses, their unwillingness to recognize what they saw as spiritual truth, and the willingness of the powers that be to use the ignorance of the masses for their own purposes. Both of them were intellectual outsiders, Xenophanes having been a wandering philosopher with his ideas often ignored by mainstream thinkers of his time, and Lorgar was an intellectual outlier being in the caravan, questioning established beliefs even as he studied them, rather than being raised within the dogma of the Covenant. Each proposed a unified cosmic order, Xenophanes' god being singular, eternal, unchanging, and not having to act physically. Lorgar's early theology suggested that the gods worshipped by the Covenant were mere facets of a deeper truth, but as he began having visions of the Emperor, which we'll talk about later, his idea of a singular divinity beyond understanding coalesced down into one anthropomorphic being. Thus, we get into the key differences between their ideas. Xenophanes rejected divine intervention, and especially embodied divinity. Xenophanes' idea of God did not meddle in human affairs. He governed the cosmos through pure thought. Lorgar, by contrast, sought signs, miracles, and direct manifestations of the divine, something that would lead him to worship the emperor, but then, later, after being disillusioned with the emperor, lead him to the eye of terror, to chaos. Xenophanes was an early skeptic, critiquing the certainty of human religious claims. Lorgar, in contrast, had an almost fanatical drive to uncover the supreme divine being, refusing to entertain the possibility that he might be wrong, and being so keen on this pattern perception that he mistakenly assigned this idea to the emperor, and then later to the gods of chaos. Xenophanes' vision of God was an abstract principle governing the universe, but Lorgar sought a deeply personal connection with the divine. He yearned for revelation, devotion, and worship. We can see this perhaps as an extension of Lorgar's search for a loving father figure. If Lorgar had remained on this theological path and fully embraced a Xenophanean Xenophonian-style monotheism, the Imperium's fate might have been radically different. If he had held firm in the belief that the four gods were merely shadows of a higher unity, perhaps he might have resisted chaos rather than embracing it. And instead of becoming a servant of the ruinous powers, he might have sought to unify humanity under a more abstract, metaphysical divine order, something akin to an imperial logos cult, rather than a cult of worship of the emperor specifically. Thus, instead of being the architect of the Imperium's religious downfall, perhaps he could have turned to being its philosopher king, shaping a belief system that emphasized reason, unity, and divine order, trying to build something greater than the flawed emperor, rather than blind faith and destruction. The emperor rejected divinity, but he might have been more willing to tolerate a Lorgar who advocated a rational, non-polytheistic theology, rather than a dogmatic, theocratic vision. But the emperor, of course, had his own problems. He needed the philosophy systems of the Imperium to support his own power personally. The idea that there were some abstract principles, like justice, which were more important than the emperor's personal power, were anathema to him. Regardless, rather than becoming the fanatic zealots of chaos, perhaps the word-bearers could have become a sect of scholars, theologians, and philosophers to guide humanity's spiritual development while resisting superstition and corruption, especially if they stayed loyal through the Horus Heresy, because then in the absence of the emperor, they would have been able to take a leadership role. Anyway, Lorgar's early theological ideas, his belief that the gods of the Covenant were mere aspects of a greater divine unity, echo the monotheistic vision of the real-life philosopher Xenophanes of Colophon. They both rejected traditional polytheism and sought a single all-encompassing divine truth, while being outsiders in their respective intellectual circles. The problem here is that where Xenophanes remained a skeptical philosopher, Lorgar was driven by an insatiable need for personal divine revelation. His hunger for truth and a new father figure led him down a path that ultimately delivered him to the emperor and then to chaos. Terrible father figure choices, with chaos specifically being the very forces he had once rejected as being shadows of a greater god. As long as we're referencing ancient Greece, let's consider the idea of the polytheistic gods being shadows of a deeper reality in the lens of Plato's allegory of the cave, found in the Republic, Book 7. All of you should be familiar with this already. Plato describes a group of prisoners who've been chained inside a dark cave since birth, being only able to see shadows cast on the wall by a fire behind them, and mistaking those shadows for reality. One prisoner is freed and ascends into the light, discovering the true world beyond the cave, but then when he returns to share his revelation, the other prisoners reject him, preferring the familiar shadows to the blinding truth. This allegory serves as a lens for understanding Lorgar's early theology, in which he viewed the many gods of Colchis not as ultimate beings, but as shadows of a deeper divinity. His belief was that the gods of the Covenant were mere manifestations, facets, or lesser echoes of a singular supreme deity. On Colchis, the people of the Covenant worshipped the four powers they believed to be gods, believing them to be the highest powers in existence, and their understanding of divinity was based on what was visible and immediate, the theocratic structures of their world. The people of Colchis never questioned, in large numbers, the divine forms they were presented with by their priesthood, just as the prisoners of the cave don't question the shadows before them. But Lorgar and the people of his caravan did what few dared to do. They turned away from the wall, and these refugees questioned the very nature of the gods that the planet was raised to worship. Like the freed prisoner of Plato's allegory, Lorgar found a new view of things. In his case, his theological journey led him to believe that these four powers were not ultimate reality or truth, but emanations of a higher divine source, a single divinity that encompassed them all. The various deities worshipped by the Covenant were not independent rival entities, but instead refractions of a grander singular force. What the Covenant mistook for divinity in its fullness was only a fraction of the true divine essence, just as the cave's prisoners mistook shadows for the full extent of reality. In this sense, Lorgar was like the freed prisoner struggling to grasp the truth beyond the familiar concepts that he had been taught, but also like in the allegory of the cave, when he returns to share his revelations with others, the others refuse to believe him. In the allegory of the cave, the other prisoners refuse to believe the guy who left. They mock him and reject his claims, preferring the comfort of familiar illusions over the terrifying uncertainty of the unknown. When Lorgar developed his own theology, he presented it to Corpheron as a set of ideas he'd been thinking of, and Corpheron violently attempted to beat the heresy out of him, attempting to force him back into the beliefs he had taught him. Corpheron was an intellectual in some sense, but he did not ultimately care about truth. He cared about power. If Lorgar discovered a higher divine truth beyond the gods of the Covenant, it would threaten Corpheron's authority, just as the freed prisoner in Plato's allegory threatens the constructed reality of the cave. Perhaps Lorgar could have fully embraced his theological enlightenment, but only if Corpheron had successfully been overthrown by the mutineers. Now, Plato's allegory ends with the freed prisoner stepping into the sunlight, seeing the ultimate truth, and becoming enlightened. But Lorgar's story did not follow this path to a perfect rational understanding of the divine. Instead, his journey took a darker turn. He continued to seek the supreme divine being throughout his life, ultimately embracing the primordial truth of chaos. And chaos was not the singular divine order he had once sought. It was a writhing, contradictory morass of violence. Thus, rather than ascending out of the cave, he was descending into a deeper cave, where these true gods were not a higher unity, but the same polytheistic forces he had once dismissed as mere shadows. The chaos gods that he had thought were mere echoes of a deeper divinity were real and terrifyingly powerful and malicious beyond any measure. Instead of finding a single truth, Lorgar became the high priest of an abyssal, ever-shifting chaos, inimical to all life. He had sought the light of ultimate truth, but he mistook the warp's flames for the sun. This brings us to, chronologically, the third great event, which shaped Lorgar's theology and his life, his visions. Lorgar did not know it, but he had psychic potential. As an untrained psyker, he occasionally had visions which he believed to be divine revelation. Unlike Kurz or Sanguinius, though, he did not have a vision of doom, but instead a recurring psychic vision of the Emperor and Magnus arriving on Colchis. I posit that Lorgar's lack of psychic training or mentorship, leading him to believe his visions to be of divine origin, were possibly of even greater importance and an even greater problem for his personal theology than were the abuse and power-hungry Corpheron. Even while facing indoctrination by Corpheron, Lorgar never stopped learning and questioning and asking people for other opinions and making up his own mind. He knew that Corpheron was just a man that he loved as a father for bad reasons, but still a man. His visions, though, were inexplicable in his experience. Because he could not explain them, Lorgar's untrained psychic visions did something insidious. They bypassed his ability to question and analyze. That is, his visions took on a sheen of infallibility in his mind, and by appearing in them, so too did the emperor. This planted within him the assumption that the emperor was a god, not merely in power, but in essence and nature. The problem here, to restate, is revelation without interpretation. He liked to question and synthesize ideas, even under Corpheron's tyranny, because of his love of learning and theological exploration. But a vision appearing unbidden in his mind is different from a text or a sermon or a debate. Unlike the holy texts he studied, which he could analyze and compare and revise, his visions were not subject to scrutiny in his mind. They simply were. Unlike the teachings of Corpheron, which Lorgar could accept or reject or adapt as per his wish, his visions felt like direct divine truth beyond question. Lorgar could argue with Corpheron, he could argue with others, he could argue with himself, but he did not believe he could argue with what he saw. Because he lacked formal psychic training, he had no framework for understanding his abilities. If Magnus had been there from the beginning, he might have told Lorgar, "This is not divine revelation, this is your mind reaching into the warp. It is real in some sense, but it is not infallible." Instead, Lorgar having no guidance, he mistook a raw psychic experience which happened to him over and over for an absolute divine truth, pointing him towards an event in the future of theological significance. Lorgar had rejected many of the teachings of the Covenant, and he'd crafted his own theology, but he thought that he had no reason to doubt his visions. If the visions were true, and if they showed the emperor's arrival, then the emperor himself must be a divine figure, because he's appearing through divine revelation. This figure in his visions took on the appearance of being beyond mortal flaws, which is a problem, because the emperor is highly flawed. Unlike the gods of Colchis, who were fragments, perhaps fragments of a greater reality or a greater divine being, the emperor appeared to Lorgar as a singular being, radiant and supreme. Clear, direct, he had no idea how to challenge these visions. And so, by the time the emperor actually arrived, Lorgar's fate was already set. His faith had been formed, and no argument could dissuade him. No command could override what had already been revealed to him, at least not without help. The tragedy here is that Lorgar's visions were real, but they were also incomplete, subjective, easily misunderstood. If he had been trained as a psyker, he might have realized that his visions were merely glimpses of possible futures, shaped by his own subconscious mind and the warp's influence. If he had been raised in a society that understood psychic phenomena, he might have been taught to question, interpret, and refine his visions, rather than treating them as absolute truths. Instead, with no one to help him, without any tools for discernment, he was left to fend for himself. This made him deeply vulnerable to later manipulation by chaos. All they needed to do was provide new visions, whispers, revelations from the warp. And against these attacks by the ruinous powers, Lorgar had no defense. His entire theological method had relied on uncritical acceptance of visions as divine truth. Just as he once mistook the emperor for God, he mistook the chaos powers as divine truth. It was only through psychic training that he would have been able to avoid his doom. Otherwise, he was doomed to be deceived by his own mind and then by the powers of the warp. If Lorgar had been given proper psychic mentorship, he would have been much better off. Let's consider first Magnus of the Thousand Sons, his brother. Magnus arrived with the emperor. He could have taught Lorgar to analyze his own visions, including his past visions, recognizing them as powerful but infallible. Lorgar was deeply spiritual, but he did have a layer of rationality, a way to test and refine beliefs rather than blindly accepting what everyone told him. Instead of seeing the emperor as an infallible god, perhaps he might have recognized him as a psychic giant worthy of admiration and perhaps emulation in many ways, but still a man. A second good option would be Malcador. Not as powerful a psychic as Magnus, but perhaps the most powerful non-emperor, non-Primarch psyker ever. He was a master of controlling belief. If he had mentored Lorgar after Lorgar was found, perhaps he might have been able to train him to be skeptical of his own experiences, to distinguish between spiritual feeling and objective testable truth. Perhaps Malcador, who, if I remember right, was there at Molech when the Emperor went through the portal, might have helped Lorgar to see the Emperor's greatness as something constructed and chosen rather than ordained by the divine. But honestly, I feel that the only real option for fixing Lorgar at the time the Emperor arrived was for the Emperor to directly intervene. And honestly, it is the Emperor's responsibility. Thus, the Emperor's greatest mistake with Lorgar was not taking his visions seriously. He arrived on Colchis to find a devoted, reverent son, and simply commanded him to stop believing, as if belief was a switch that could be turned off. Because the Emperor never engaged with Lorgar's visions at all, Lorgar never doubted his visions, so he never doubted the Emperor's divinity. The only way to save him would have been for Lorgar to be trained and guided, to gain the intellectual and psychic tools to question what he thought was divine revelation, and the Emperor needed to be personally involved. Instead, the Emperor let him do his own thing and then rebuked him, and so when chaos came whispering, Lorgar had no way to resist. Anyway, back to the caravan. After the mutiny, Corpheron switched tactics. No longer would he physically abuse Lorgar. The risk was too great. He conceded the theological battle regarding Lorgar's monotheism and focused on his ear for power. Lorgar converted the members of the caravan and many that they met to his monotheistic faith, and he called them all the Godsworn to distinguish them from the Covenant. They freed many slaves in their travels, who, as you might guess, mostly joined them. With a leader, with charisma, and with manpower now available to him, Corpheron saw that the time for sharpening his weapon was over, and it was time to attack. Lorgar had grown into such a great orator that his speech itself was a weapon. So when it was time to use this weapon, when Corpheron turned him towards the cities ruled by the Covenant and began to wage war against his political enemies, it was not initially a war of blades. At the first city they came to, the gates were barred and the walls manned to repel an expected military assault. But Lorgar was not a military commander deep down. He never became one. War was a thing he learned how to do pretty good, not like amazingly well, as a tool to accomplish what he really wanted. He did not throw his band at the walls in a berserker frenzy. He did not carefully besiege the city, and he did not sneak in during the dead of night to assassinate or terrorize. Instead of acting like some of his brothers may have, he stood at the gates and sermonized until the acolytes of the great temple of that city killed their own high priests with their own hands, and the guards threw open their own gates to present the bodies of the high priests while cheering Lorgar's entrance. This moment in Lorgar's life is deeply revealing and deeply formative. It shows his unique strength and his greatest weakness, his absolute belief in the power of words, faith, and the inevitability of conversion. Any other Primarch would have used force or guile or strategic cunning, or diplomacy to convince them it's a good idea to join them. No. Lorgar's war was not one of persuasion and devotion. It was a war of faith. He persuaded people's hearts, sure. He made them devoted to his vision of monotheism, sure. But he did not merely convince people, he reshaped their very sense of reality. Lorgar's speech was transformational. He did not need to conquer people's bodies if he could conquer their souls. This was what made him so dangerous before chaos ever entered his life. Lorgar always inspired total devotion. He created zealots. His converts accepted his message, and then they acted upon it, even to the point of killing those who had previously been the most important people to them. Belief, Lorgar understands, is a matter of life and death. Those who listened to him were compelled to choose a side. This stayed the same throughout his life. This is why Lorgar was sent by Horus to try to recruit Alfarius and Kurz and Perturabo in the lead-up to Istvan V. Horus knew that those three assholes would have to choose a side, and he was gambling that they would choose his. Everywhere Lorgar went, either the people he met accepted his truth and overturned their old masters, or they stood against him. His presence alone forced a reckoning. No drawn-out diplomacy, Gilliman style or Horus style. Lorgar understood faith as a means of power. Lorgar did not care about power for himself the way Corpheron did, but Lorgar knew that faith moved armies. This is what made him different from any of his brothers. He does not need a sword. His voice is sharper. Gilliman or Dorn would have laid siege or negotiated political alliances or established a new stable government after taking the city. Russ or Angron would have stormed the gates in a berserker rage, taking victory through raw violence and fury. Korax or Kurz or Alfarius would have infiltrated the city and removed his leadership from within, turning the people before they knew they had been conquered. Perturabo or Ferris Manus would have calculated the most effective way to besiege and storm the city, leaving the city broken but obedient. Lorgar could have convinced them to let him in. Instead, he conquered the hearts of the people before even bothering to set foot inside. His enemies were cast down by their own followers, erased as though they had never truly ruled. This was a dangerous precedent for Lorgar's future. This victory proved to Lorgar that his faith alone was enough to reshape the world, and it also planted some dangerous questions in his mind for later. If faith was enough to overthrow cities, why would the emperor not want to rule through faith? If this message was strong enough to cause men to kill their own masters, was it not divine? If he was right, here at this city, how could he ever be wrong? Lorgar was learning the wrong lesson from success, that faith was not just powerful, but inevitable. He began to believe that resistance to belief was unnatural, a flaw to be corrected, a sin to be purged, and thus why, when the emperor said no belief, he held the emperor in such high esteem that he did not really believe that. Instead, he thought that the emperor must necessarily be too good to fail to believe, and so must be secretly believing. This city was the true beginning of the word-bearers in essence. Lorgar wasn't gathering followers, he was creating a movement, and he demanded absolute belief and absolute obedience. Not all the cities of Colchis converted. Lorgar did face some violent resistance, and so Lorgar reluctantly became a self-taught military leader. remaking his band of outcasts and refugees into a fanatical army who purged heretics with flame and blade. Lorgar never lost his reluctance to military leadership. He never thought of himself as being primarily a warrior. In this, he stood apart from his brothers for his entire life. This reluctance towards warfare and martial pursuits is one of the most defining aspects of his character. It sets him apart from all his brothers, even Magnus, who preferred knowledge, or Guilliman, who valued governance. Both of them still embraced warfare as a means to an end and thought of themselves as great warriors, which they were. Lorgar never saw himself as a warrior at all. He only ever turned to warfare as a necessity, not for the purpose of conquest, but for the eradication of heresy. This mindset carried forward into the word-bearers, both when serving the emperor and when rebelling against the emperor. They saw their wars as holy crusades, purging those who refused enlightenment. Lorgar did not love war, but he learned how to wage it, just as he had once learned how to preach. He developed an understanding of war as a tool to bring about conversion and purge those who would refuse conversion. Because he was never really a military tactician, he did not create a professional army. He created a zealot horde, not fighting for land, but for faith. Because of their fanaticism, they were willing to burn, kill, and die for the truth they believed in, even though they, for the most part, lacked military discipline. The word-bearers, notably, had already learned how to fight as Astartes with military discipline and tactics and stuff before Lorgar arrived. He didn't teach them that stuff. The warriors of Colchis, the warriors of his legion, saw him as more than a leader. He was their prophet. Each one of the Primarchs had a fundamental identity tied to war. Guilliman saw war as a means to create order, Horus as a game to be mastered. Dorn, war was a duty to be endured. Kurz saw war as a punishment for the wicked. But Lorgar never saw himself as a warrior at all. War was simply a tragic necessity, a means to remove obstacles to faith. Because he never embraced war the way his brothers did, he was always at a disadvantage when forced to fight on purely military terms. Lorgar wanted words to be enough, but when they weren't, he learned to kill. Corpheron used this to twist Lorgar further, framing war as a holy instrument of the divine. Lorgar did not like war. He may have even hated war, but he did not question its necessity, and he did not hesitate to use it. Thus we find the contradictions of Lorgar. He was a man of peace who wielded war. He was a man of wisdom who relied upon fanaticism. He was a man who sought enlightenment, but refused to question his own certainty. The Horus heresy emerged from these contradictions, a war which made no sense, fought by a man who hated war, but who saw no other path. We might contrast this with the emperor, who loved war so much that he never seriously considered alternatives. And so, the first of Lorgar's wars on Colchis ended. After taking Varadesh and Gahevarla and various other cities of Colchis, Lorgar had achieved Corpheron's goals. Corpheron was now high priest of the Covenant. The world had been conquered under Lorgar's rule, and Lorgar cared not one bit. I'm calm now. Lorgar had won the war, but he had no interest in ruling. He did not set about consolidating his success. He did not reform the government. He had no interest in stabilizing his conquests or creating laws or establishing governance. The material concerns of power, order, and rule were meaningless to him. Only the salvation of the soul mattered. Lorgar was not playing political games for some worldly puissance. He was converting the souls of his world to true faith, and his visions intensified. He preached that his one true God was arriving soon, and all needed to convert to the monotheism of the Godsworn. The theocratic government of the Covenant was disrupted, the status quo was being upended, and there was no obvious political goal of Lorgar's that was being advanced by this upheaval. At this time, the Covenant came to understand that Lorgar was serious about the whole religion thing, and Corpheron realized that things were truly out of his control. Lorgar's only goal was to convert others, not to rule them. So while Corpheron had used Lorgar's victories to seize power, he had no way to stop Lorgar from going further. Lorgar only cared about his prophetic visions. Yeah, Corpheron had power. He'd always been interested in power for power's sake. And Lorgar's refusal to engage with politics created a vacuum, and Corpheron stepped into the void. But even though Corpheron had spent Lorgar's entire life manipulating Lorgar, guiding him towards Corpheron's ambitions, now he had lost control. He had expected Lorgar to be a weapon, a useful tool to overthrow his political rivals. He'd never believed in Lorgar's faith. It was just a means to an end. But Lorgar's faith was beyond his or anyone else's control. This was Corpheron's worst nightmare. A prophet who actually believes in his own prophecies. Likewise, the leaders of the Covenant saw Lorgar as just another challenger. They understood Corpheron. He was a guy who had been exiled because he was politically defeated. Now he was back, and his protege was leading an army to back his political ambitions. Okay, they can work with that. They can negotiate with Corpheron, integrate him into their existing power structures and power struggles. No, not with Lorgar. They realize the truth now. Lorgar was not interested in power. He was not a politician. Lorgar was a fanatic. He could not be bribed or threatened or reasoned with. He could only be believed, or he could be opposed. This terrified the Covenant because it meant that Lorgar's war could not possibly end with any sort of negotiated settlement or conditional surrender or Lorgar seizing power and then starting to reform things. It would only end with Lorgar's death or with all of Colchis converted to his faith. With Corpheron unable to restrain Lorgar and the Covenant realizing that his faith was real, the stage was set for the final war of Colchis. The Covenant could not ignore Lorgar. His faith was too disruptive. Corpheron could no longer control Lorgar. His prophecies no longer served any political ends. Having achieved the top of the mountain, Corpheron wanted stability, not further radical action. This final religious civil war on Colchis was not just about power. It was a war of faith versus heresy, the past versus the future. And at the heart of it was Lorgar, the prophet who would not be swayed, high on his own fucking supply. In keeping with real-life civil wars, the civil war on Colchis was so much worse than the War of Conquest had been. The Covenant sent men to arrest Lorgar for heresy, and those men were slaughtered by Lorgar's fanatics, and the battle lines were drawn. Every city, every household, every person on Colchis ultimately had to choose a side. No one could sit this one out. They were called the Schism Wars. It was a series of civil wars that lasted 6 years and killed roughly a third of the population of Colchis. A third of the fucking population of Colchis? The Schism Wars here were in many ways the true crucible that shaped Lorgar. Before, conversion often came through peaceful persuasion, through sermonizing. But he'd already convinced everyone who could be convinced. Now, the war was an all-consuming bloodbath fought entirely in his name. Civil wars are often the most brutal because they turn neighbors into enemies and set brother against brother. A war of faith is somehow even worse. No compromise is possible, so it can only end in total annihilation. Either your side is righteous and the other is damned, or vice versa. Colchis was already deeply religious, so this war was not political, it was a war of souls. The scale of destruction was unimaginable to any sort of earthly comparison. This is like Chinese uprisings style levels of devastation. Cities burned, families were torn apart, siblings murdered each other, a third of the planet died. This was not the conversion of Colchis that Lorgar had imagined. He was not a military leader at heart. He had begun his journey as a preacher, but now he found himself a warlord. His first great victory was converting a city without raising a sword. Now he sent his armies to burn cities to the ground. He tried to bring a message of unity, and instead he had torn his world apart. Remember the paradox of Lorgar's faith, a belief in unity that always seemed to lead to division and destruction. By the time the Schism Wars ended, Lorgar's original message had been warped by those who followed him, because in war the most extreme voices often rise to the top. His early followers had been preachers and freed slaves. By the end of the war, his armies were filled with zealots and executioners. The more moderate voices either died or were silenced, and so, by the social evaporative cooling effect, only fanatics remained. And there were a fucking lot of them. Even though Lorgar himself had not changed, the nature of his movement had changed. The Schism Wars were a microcosm of Lorgar's entire life, a pattern that would repeat again and again. He preaches unity, and his followers bring war. He wants to uplift, but his legacy is always destruction, just as he would later be the instigation of leading the Imperium into the heresy. Lorgar had now led Colchis into ruin in the name of faith. Here, we come to what I think may be the most interesting period of Lorgar's life, the time after achieving victory in the Schism Wars, but before the arrival of the Emperor. I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on this time span. I'm going to use a bunch of different methods of interpretation, real-world parallels. It's awesome. Sit down, get a snack, just listen. Okay, so after purging everyone who turned against him, putting a third of the population of his planet to the sword, after burning down cities, upending the government, he is experiencing visions of increasing strength and frequency, and Lorgar makes an announcement to his people. The one true God will descend from the heavens to visit Colchis bodily within 1 year, and he will introduce himself with the name the Emperor. Deep breath. There it is. Lorgar has locked himself in. He has left no wiggle room. He has a deadline. He has strict criteria for evaluating success, and nobody could possibly do anything to influence whether it happens. Nobody could try to fake it or anything of the sort. Either there will be this miraculous meeting with a god of flesh and blood, or there will not. Corferon, the consummate manipulator, foresaw collapse. There was no way for him to fake a miracle. He must have been absolutely shitting his pants. Lorgar had always been zealous, but this was something new, a prophecy utterly beyond Corpheron's control. This was a fucking wild gamble. Lorgar had spent his entire life searching for divine truth, and now he had made the ultimate claim about it. You motherfuckers! A specific god with a specific name would appear incarnate in a body in a specific time frame. If the year passed without the emperor's arrival, his entire faith would be shattered. His people had already burned their past and committed unimaginable violence in his name. If they thought he had led them astray, they would have torn him apart like the hyenas did to Scar at the end of the first Lion King movie. This gamble had everything at stake, and Corpheron had found the limits of his tactics. Corpheron was fundamentally a manipulator. He had spent decades shaping Lorgar into his instrument, but now his instrument had outgrown him. Corpheron was a master of political maneuvering, but this situation was beyond politics. He could not fake a god. He could not rig a miracle. If the emperor did not arrive, Lorgar's credibility would be annihilated, and with it, Corpheron's power base. For maybe the first time in his entire life, Corpheron was truly helpless. And what does that do to Colchis? The war was over, the covenant was broken, the planet was theocratically united, but you can't move forward. The government can't take action, because why try to build a future if a god is about to arrive? The economy must have stalled, because who cares about trade or industry when you are on the verge of divine revelation? The entire population lived in a state of apocalyptic expectation. Every sermon, every moment of daily life must have revolved around the coming of this emperor. That's a lot of pressure Lorgar had applied to himself. Lorgar was trapped by his own prophecy. If the emperor did not arrive, he would have no way to explain away his failure. He would thus face the wrath of his own people. As the year ticked away, there was nothing he could do except wait and hope. There are some very important real-world parallels. Lorgar's situation mirrors historical millenarian movements, where people expect the imminent arrival of a divine figure or apocalyptic transformation. As you might imagine, the expectation of an impending radical transformation of society or the world can inspire hope and fear, as they promise the end of suffering, oppression, or injustice, but often bring violence, or conflict, or some form of moral failure is associated. Let us look at some millenarian movements and see what we can learn about Lorgar. So first, the Millerites. William Miller predicted Christ's return in the U.S. in 1844. Millerites believed that Christ would return, the righteous would be saved, and the wicked would be destroyed. The date became known as the Great Disappointment after, spoiler alert, nothing happened on that day. Afterwards, some abandoned the faith, while the remainder experienced the social evaporative cooling effect and created the Seventh-day Adventist cult. This example thus highlights the fragility of millenarian movements, where failure can either disillusion or lead to further reinterpretation. Unfulfilled predictions can shape new religious ideas and communities, sometimes for the worse. Ghost dance was a religious movement among Native American tribes, particularly among the Lakota, in the late 19th century, led by a Powhite prophet named Wovoka. I hope I'm pronouncing all that stuff right. He claimed that ancestral spirits would return and a great flood would cleanse the earth, allowing Native Americans to reclaim their land and way of life from the encroaching settlers. The movement was centered around the ritual dance, in which participants hoped to bring about a spiritual and physical renewal, leading to the restoration of Native American power and autonomy. It was seen as a reaction to the devastating impact of European colonization and the near total destruction of native cultures and societies. The ghost dance was seen as a threat by the U.S. federal government, leading to the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, where hundreds of Lakota were murdered by the U.S. While the movement did not bring about the promised transformation, it represents a response to colonial oppression and the desire for cultural and spiritual restoration. Thus, we can see oppressed people turn to millenarian movements sometimes when they become desperate and their hopes of reform or recovery seem to be fading. The Taiping Rebellion in China from 1850 to 1864 was led by Hong Xiuquan, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which would be based on his interpretation of Christian teachings with elements of Confucianism and traditional Chinese beliefs. Hong believed that he was divinely chosen to create a new world order where people would live according to his vision of equality, communal living, and religious devotion. He preached a moral and spiritual revolution, calling for the abolition of traditional Chinese customs like foot binding or the veneration of ancestors. When you say rebellion or uprising in Chinese history, what you mean is civil war. The rebellion was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, killing an estimated 20 to 30 million people. So, though the Taiping forces were initially successful in capturing large areas, the rebellion ultimately failed due to internal strife, military losses, and the endurance and resilience of the Qing government. The Taiping Rebellion was a millenarian challenge to the established order, representing a political and religious vision of redemption and utopia, though it ultimately ended in failure and devastation. We can see from how Chinese culture developed in the decades since then, the decades immediately following, that it is possible for cultures to recover after sustaining massive, massive losses in civil war, followed by a failure of a promised religious movement. Vaguely similarly, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 was a traumatic event for Christendom, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire. Some Christian monks, particularly in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, saw this as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and the impending end of the world. The monks believed that the fall of Constantinople was a sign of divine judgment upon the world. Some of them claimed that the city's destruction heralded the end times, or that the second coming of Christ was imminent. This led to the proliferation of apocalyptic sermons and calls for repentance. The fall of Constantinople, as you might imagine, caused fear and despair among the Christian population, leading to reform movements in the Catholic Church and the rise of new forms of Christian mysticism. And so we can see how catastrophic geopolitical changes can fuel millenarian beliefs, as the fall of a great city, or in this case the imminent fall of a great city, is often interpreted as divine punishment or the coming of a new world order. In 1649, during the English Civil War, there was a group of radical English Protestants called the Digger Movement. They sought to create a new egalitarian society based on communal land ownership and the rejection of private property. They're not the only group to ever read the Book of Acts and come up with communist ideas, but, they're one of them. Their ideas were heavily influenced by millenarian thinking, particularly their belief that the end of the world as it was known would lead to a new, just social order. They believed that land should be shared equally among all people, particularly the poor, and that the world was entering a period of spiritual and social renewal. They rejected traditional hierarchies and sought to create self-sustaining, egalitarian communes which were free from oppression. The movement, spoiler alert, failed due to both internal dissent and also resistance from established authorities on both the royalist and the Puritan sides. Their ideas did live on as part of the broader tradition of radical reform movements, but they did not transform England into a communist utopia. The Diggers represent a more utopian vision of millenarianism, where they're not thinking so much that the wicked are going to be punished, but rather they're focused on social equality and justice. Once again, we see millenarian movements can arrive from social, and in this case economic, dissatisfaction. Each of these movements arose in response to significant social upheaval or general dissatisfaction with how things are going. We talked about colonization, we talked about political oppression. Generally speaking, the belief in a coming transformation offers hope or escape from the harshness of one's current reality. These movements share a few features, like having a charismatic leader and having a desperation for redemption. People turn to millenarian visions of change when they feel that society has failed them sometimes. This doesn't matter so much whether it's war or oppression or economic injustice. People seek a spiritual answer when they can't change their physical conditions. Most of these movements seem to be apocalyptic in nature, focusing on the idea that the old world has to be destroyed for a new world to emerge. You can see this nowadays with leftist accelerationist ideas. In general, if you think it's revolutionary action or divine intervention or cosmic rebirth, you're thinking that the old ways have to fall apart to give way to something better. Generally speaking, while these movements don't achieve their promised transformation, they do have an impact and bring about lasting change in some form, whether it's the spread of new religious ideas, or of political reforms, or the formation of new social movements, or 20 million dead Chinese people. We can see generally, with the diverse cultural and historical contexts here, millenarian movements generally arise as a response to deep-seated fears, hopes, and dreams for societal transformation, mixed with a deep certainty that acting through conventional means will not work. They also demonstrate how the gap between belief and reality can lead to inspiration and devastation. Like these movements, Lorgar had bet everything on divine intervention, and if it did not come, the psychological and social fallout at Colchis would be catastrophic. And thus, we have the question, if the Emperor had not arrived within that year, would Lorgar have doubled down, or just collapsed into despair before the mobs killed him? Would Corferon have been successful in trying to seize the opportunity to reassert control, or would he have been killed? How would Colchis have reacted to tearing itself apart in a third religious civil war immediately after? In the end, the Emperor did actually arrive at Colchis in the canon, saving Lorgar from utter disaster. But was this fate, divine intervention, psychic premonition, or simply luck? The timing was so perfect that Lorgar took it as proof that his beliefs were true. Whereas, of course, the Emperor was just expanding the Imperium in a military operation. Lorgar saw what he wanted to see. That self-deception continues with him forever. If the Emperor had not arrived within the year, it would have certainly meant a third massive religious war on Colchis. Within a decade, the surviving people of the planet had the blood of a third of their previous number on their hands. Fathers had killed sons, sisters had killed brothers, cities had been burned to the ground. Absolutely everyone knew someone who had died in one or both of Lorgar's wars. If the date came and went with no emperor, the population certainly would have torn Lorgar and Corferon apart. That's terrifying. The people of Colchis had already sacrificed everything for Lorgar's prophecy. If the emperor had not arrived, it would have been a total existential crisis for a civilization already drenched in blood. The Covenant had already been shattered, and the survivors had remade their entire world in the image of the Godsworn. If the prophecy had failed, they would have been left adrift, with nothing left but the horror of what they had done. In the wake of the two religious civil wars, Lorgar's charismatic authority was the main thing holding Colchis together. If the prophecy failed, his people would have immediately seen him as a fraud. His most devoted followers would have probably stayed with him due to the evaporative cooling effect, but everyone else would have turned on them in rage and grief. He would have been executed by the very mobs that once worshipped with him. And of course, without Lorgar's aura of divinity, Corpheron was just an old schemer with a bad reputation. Many already hated him, and they would have blamed him for leading Lorgar astray. He would not have survived. Then, of course, the survivors on the world would have just collapsed into anarchy. People had already lost family, friends, homes. They'd destroyed cities. Without a unifying vision, Colchis would have descended into endless blood feuds. Factions would have splintered. A very few would have tried to cling to faith, again, evaporative cooling. But others would have just sought revenge. Instead of arriving to find a devout world ready to bow before the Emperor, when the Imperium arrived, they would have found a burning wasteland, a ruined planet of fanatics, warlords, and despairing survivors. If Lorgar survived, the Emperor would have found him broken and humiliated. But more likely, he would have been killed already. Thus, no word-bearers, no remaking of the Legion, and possibly no Horus Heresy as we know it. In that moment, when the year was drawing to a close and the Emperor had not yet come, Lorgar must have been standing on the edge of oblivion. What must Lorgar's mindset have been like at that time? It would be completely understandable and relatable if he had some sort of crisis of faith, or doubts, or anxiety, or fear, or if he was second-guessing his choices. But interestingly, we do know something about Lorgar's mindset near the end of that time based on canon. Corpheron, seeing disaster coming, approached him and delicately spoke with him about theology. He confessed to him that he still believed in the four powers of the Covenant, but also believed that Lorgar's God was the most powerful of all. There we go. He is presenting an off-ramp to Lorgar, a way to pivot, a compromise, a method of perhaps walking back some of the more extreme things. And who really cares about that deadline anyway? Lorgar thanked him for his honesty and forgave him for not being as free from doubt as he himself was. And he reassured Corpheron the Emperor would arrive before the end of the year. Lorgar was not crumpled into a ball of anxiety, second-guessing all of his choices, which would have been entirely understandable. He was not desperately clawing at any possibility to survive as day after day went by with no emperor and no second option. This consummate scholar was not examining alternatives. He was a true believer. He was faithful. All he needed was belief. All he needed was faith. This is terrifying. Lorgar wasn't just hoping the Emperor would arrive. He was certain. He had no backup plan, no contingency, no room for doubt. The world around him had been reduced to ashes and hordes of zealots, and yet he stood unshaken, utterly convinced that his prophecy was divine truth. There's something deeply unsettling about this level of faith. Most people, even the most devout, when confronted with the possibility of the total collapse of everything they've built, would at least entertain the idea of being wrong. They would flinch, recalculate, seek a way out. Corpheron, with his scheming, was doing the rational thing, offering a pivot, an escape hatch, an adjustment to reality before it was too late. But Lorgar forgave Corpheron for his doubt and reaffirmed that his prophecy was going to happen with absolute conviction. This is faith at its most terrifying, the kind that does not bend even under the weight of imminent catastrophe. Lorgar had moved beyond being a mere theologian. He was no longer a thinker. He was a prophet in the truest sense. His faith had consumed him. And then the fact that he was right, that the emperor really did descend from the heavens just in time, that cemented this mindset for the rest of his life. He would never doubt again. Here, we find ourselves scrambling for some way to try to understand Lorgar's extreme mindset at this time. Some fictional or historical parallel that we might use to try to make it easier to connect with his extreme situation. Looking for real-world comparisons for Lorgar at this time, we find plenty of company for him. The nature of these historical parallels is also terrifying. Shoko Asahara, David Koresh, Jim Jones, Marshall Applewhite, Roche Ferrault, I don't know how to pronounce that, João Maria de Agostini. Again, I don't know how to pronounce that. I took Spanish, not French or Portuguese. Anyway, Lorgar at this moment stands among history's most infamous doomsday cult leaders. These cult leaders share some elements with millenarian movements. They start from a place of charismatic authority, a sense of persecution, and a belief in an imminent world-changing event. They have to have complete self-confidence. You know, like Lorgar. By claiming divine authority or secret knowledge, prophetic insight, they lead their followers to believe in an impending cataclysmic event that will either destroy the world or transform it. Their leadership is often marked by strict control and an unwavering belief in their own vision, sometimes leading to violence or mass deaths. Again, the similarities with Lorgar just keep piling up. Shoko Asahara founded Aum Shinrikyo, a Japanese doomsday cult from 1980s until 1995. It combines some elements of Buddhism, Hindu, Christianity, and conspiracy theories. He claimed to be a messianic figure, predicting a global apocalypse in which only his followers would survive. Specifically, he prophesied a nuclear holocaust initiated by the United States, which would wipe out most of humanity and usher in a new world order. Asahara and his followers, then, would be the chosen survivors, tasked with rebuilding civilization. He taught that the cult had to trigger global chaos to hasten the coming end, and that his followers needed to prepare for the apocalypse. In 1995, members of Aum Shinrikyo carried out the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack at his direction, killing 13 people and injuring over 1,000. The cult had also attempted biological warfare attacks before the sarin gas attack. Asahara's predicted nuclear war, spoiler alert, did not result, and he was arrested and executed in 2018. It takes a while to execute someone after they're arrested, you know? He represents the extreme danger of apocalyptic cults when they actively try to bring about their own prophecy, shifting from belief to violent action. Like Lorgar, Asahara believed that his prophecy was absolutely certain, that he was divinely chosen to reshape the world, and that killing people was a price that was worth paying. His absolute certainty led to catastrophic consequences, with his cult turning to terrorism when the prophecy failed to manifest. Vernon Wayne Howell renamed himself to David Koresh, and he became the leader of the Branch Davidians, a splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventist cult. Through the 1980s until 1993, he claimed to be the Lamb of God who could interpret the Bible's hidden meanings, particularly the 7 seals from the Book of Revelation. He claimed to be the final prophet of Christianity, the Lamb of Revelation, and claimed that only he could interpret the 7 seals of the Bible. Koresh taught that the world was approaching the final battle of Armageddon, and that his followers had to prepare for a violent confrontation with the government. He claimed divine authority, and like a bunch of different cult leaders, he claimed the right to take multiple wives, some of whom were underage. He ordered his group to stockpile weapons at their compound in Waco, Texas, believing the U.S. government to be an agent of Satan. In 1993, the FBI and ATF raided the compound, leading to a 51-day siege that ended in a fire. 76 Branch Davidians died from fire and gunshots, including women, Koresh, and of course, children who were there. Again, like Lorgar, Koresh was absolutely certain the prophecy would come true, and he was willing to use violence. He isolated himself and his followers, rejecting outside influence, and his apocalyptic certainty led to violent confrontation and destruction, similar to how Lorgar's beliefs later led him to war against the Imperium. Jim Jones of the People's Temple, USA and Guyana, 1950s through 1978. He started as a Christian preacher, advocating racial equality and social justice in a progressive Christian church called the People's Temple. He later went off the rails, claiming to be a messianic figure who could perform miracles and communicate with God. He blended Christianity, socialism, and paranoia into his teachings. His People's Temple evolved into an apocalyptic cult, and they relocated to Jonestown in Guyana, where he exerted complete control over his followers and isolated them from outside influence. He believed that America was doomed, corrupt, and evil due to racial and economic injustice. Sound off in the comments if you think he had something going there. He also believed that only his followers would be saved in a pure utopian community of the People's Temple, and that there was a final confrontation coming, which they would have to face together. Jim Jones felt that if they could not win, they had to die on their own terms. After an attempt by sitting U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan to investigate Jonestown, Jones ordered the murder of Ryan and his delegation. It's pretty rare, I'll say, for sitting U.S. congressmen to be murdered. Jones then commanded his followers to commit mass suicide by drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid and Flavor Aid, and forced obedience at gunpoint. Before the actual event, he also ran several dry runs to lessen their resistance to this extreme act. But during the event, he did still have to force people at gunpoint. They knew that what they were doing was fucking crazy. Sorry to use foul language. 918 people died, though, including over 300 children, in this mass murder-suicide. Jones represents an extreme form of cult control, where paranoia, isolation, and apocalyptic beliefs lead to mass deaths, and the cult leader harming the cult followers. His ability to manipulate his followers into dying for his vision is a chilling reminder of how destructive millenarian leaders can be. Like Lorgar, Jones was completely convinced of his own prophetic role in history. He created an isolated community, reinforcing his followers' belief in his divine mission. His certainty led to self-destruction, just as Lorgar's led to his fall into chaos. And his willingness to harm his own followers based on his beliefs can be seen perhaps as an analog of Lorgar being willing to inflict demonic possession upon his own Marines. How Maria de Agostini was an Italian monk and wandering prophet who gained a large following in Brazil in the 19th century. He preached a radical form of Christianity that included predictions of an imminent apocalypse. He claimed that the world would soon be cleansed of corruption and that his followers needed to withdraw from society to prepare for divine intervention. He gathered a large group of peasants and indigenous followers and warned them of the coming destruction of the sinful world. He didn't lead an armed rebellion, and he didn't order violence, as far as I can tell from researching on the internet. But his movement did create conflicts with local authorities, who saw his influence as dangerous. After his death, his movement continued to inspire uprisings and religious sects in Brazil, some of which turned to violence. His wanderings, his prophetic sermons, and his rejection of worldly authority kind of mirrors Lorgar's early life on Colchis with the nomadic caravan, and then he inspired a religious movement that outlived him, much like how the Word Bearers Legion carries on Lorgar's beliefs even after he withdrew from leadership following or at least withdrew from active leadership following the Horus Heresy. Marshall Applewhite led the Heaven's Gate cult in the U.S. from 1970s up to 1997. They were a UFO-based religious movement. He convinced his followers that he was an alien prophet sent to guide them to salvation before the earth was destroyed. He claimed that earthly existence was a test and that followers needed to shed their human bodies to ascend to a higher plane. He told them that Earth was about to be recycled, I think is the term he used, and that the only escape was to ascend to a higher plane of existence by using a spaceship hidden behind the Hale-Bopp comet, which would take the souls of the faithful to safety if they shed their earthly bodies by using suicide as a necessary step to achieve salvation. You hear how this sounds, right? People did this. You are not immune to cults. You, the person watching, could fall into a cult. You got to be careful. Sorry, I'm calm now. Anyway, in 1997, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate committed mass suicide, believing they would join the aliens hiding behind the comet. It just doesn't sound better anytime you say it. Like, it sounds worse every time. These people left behind videotaped messages, eerily calm and convinced of their coming ascension. I think there's like a guy who got left behind who like stayed alive in order to update their website and stuff. What? He like responded to emails for years. Heaven's Gate shows how apocalyptic belief doesn't always require violence. Sometimes the faithful will willingly embrace death for their perceived salvation. Marshall Applewhite, like Lorgar, believed completely in his own prophecy and refused to consider that he might be wrong. Neither of them had a backup plan in case they were wrong. The followers of the Heaven's Gate cult were utterly devoted to Marshall's vision, just like the Colchisians and later the Word-Bearers were to Lorgar, and his apocalyptic certainty led to destruction and the harm done to the people who followed him, mirroring how Lorgar's certainty led to his embrace of chaos, to the Horus Heresy, and to inflicting demonic possession on his Marines. Okay, this one's a wild one, so like maybe skip ahead a few minutes if you're queasy. Roche Therault was a French-Canadian cult leader who founded the Ant Hill Kids, 1970s to like 1989, I think, is a doomsday cult based on his twisted version of Christianity, saying that he was the Messiah, had a divine mandate to prepare his followers for the coming apocalypse, and had the authority to use extreme physical punishment, suffering, and torture in order to purify the cult members. Complete obedience was required, with followers being tortured if they questioned him. His leadership turned into horrific abuse, including severe mutilations, torture, and murder. He was eventually arrested in 1989 after a follower escaped and revealed the extent of the crimes. He died in prison in 2011, murdered by another inmate. Some people make the world a better place while they're still alive, but not everyone. Therault represents an extreme end of apocalyptic cult control, where millenarianism is used to prepare for the end of the world by justifying horrific physical abuse, emotional abuse, and complete domination, control, and isolation of followers. Perhaps we might see correlation here with the dangerous methods used in canon to make humans into Astartes. Perhaps we might see a Fisher King correlation with the Ministerum's obsession with pain as a purifying sacrament in 40K. From these examples, we can see some common themes among apocalyptic cult leaders. Each of them claimed to have unique knowledge or divine insight that sets them apart. They built systems of obedience where followers were encouraged to be cut off from outside perspectives. These leaders generally promise a world-ending event. The exact form doesn't matter. It can be nuclear war or divine judgment or aliens, but like It's got to be a coming big change to the world. And in many of these cases, the leaders were willing to die or commit violence, but they also were able to convince many of their followers to die or commit mass violence for the prophecy. Apocalyptic cult leaders manipulate people's fears and hopes, offering salvation on the one hand and terror on the other. They use the promise of escape from destruction to keep their followers loyal, even when they're doing horrible things to them. When apocalyptic cult leaders believe that the world is on the brink of a cosmic transformation and that they're chosen to lead their followers through it, their absolute certainty led them to reject all outside perspectives, leading to violence and self-destruction. In the final days on Colchis, before the Emperor's arrival, Lorgar shares some striking similarities with these figures, from his unquestioning belief in his own prophecy and the isolation of his followers from outside influences, to his messianic self-image and his group's history of terrible violence. The fictional story echoes the real history of cult leaders, and that's why we're doing this. By learning more about Lorgar, we can learn more about how our own world works. We can see how people fall into cults. We can get some insight into the mind of the apocalyptic cult leader. Now, the thing is, in canon, Lorgar's path mirrors theirs almost exactly, but with one fundamental, shattering difference. He was right. This is what makes Lorgar so disturbing. If Jim Jones really had been speaking to God, if there really were aliens behind the Haley Bop spaceship ready to take people on who had committed suicide, then maybe the madness of the leaders would have been vindicated, but they were wrong, and the world rightly crushed them. For Lorgar, though, the sky opened, the Emperor arrived, the prophecy was fulfilled, and that meant that in Lorgar's mind, faith alone had saved him. He hadn't outmaneuvered his enemies. He hadn't persuaded the people through reason. He hadn't forced reality to comply with him. He simply had faith, and it had been rewarded. From this point forward, Lorgar knows that faith is all that matters. Truth, observable reality, doubt, they are irrelevant compared to belief. Lorgar's situation, though, also meant that he had another thing most of these figures did not. He had a powerful physical, external authority figure who could break the illusion. The Emperor. He put his faith in an embodied person who could make his own choices. Monarchia was the shattering of Lorgar's prophecy, much like the failed prophecies of other cult leaders. Remember, we talked about the Great Disappointment. It's not just disappointing, though. It is apocalyptic, because in his mind, faith cannot be wrong. It must lead to salvation. Therefore, his faith was right. It was just aimed at the wrong target. If the Emperor is not a god, then someone else must be. What could Lorgar have learned from the people of Colchis during that time? He saw his own certainty reflected in his most fanatical military zealots, sure. Among the masses, he must have noticed the more natural human reactions. Building pressure, people becoming more performative in their devotion as they try to assuage their own doubts and fears. Individuals starting to show cracks as their grief for loved ones who were killed in Lorgar's wars bubbles up to the surface and conflicts with their belief that it must have all been worth it. The people of Colchis were not monolithic in their faith, and Lorgar, even in the depths of fanaticism, was an exceptional observer of human nature. Even though he dismissed doubts and uncertainties as weaknesses, he saw them. He could have learned some things from the people of Colchis. Faith and doubt exist side by side. Some tried to bury their doubts under increasingly performative devotion, trying to convince themselves, This is a phenomenon seen in many radical movements, not just religious, it's especially like political movements that comes about. Lorgar would have seen that faith is not absolute in his people. It fluctuates. It grapples with reality. If he had embraced doubt as a part of faith, he might have had a healthier, more flexible worldview. Instead, he interpreted doubt as failure, which later made him despise the emperor for questioning his beliefs and rejecting secular philosophy altogether. I think I made a grammar error in that sentence. I shouldn't have used the gerund form. Whatever, too late now. I'm not going to do a second take. Anyway, Lorgar should have been able to see from his people that violence does not create true belief. The survivors of the Schism Wars were not all willing converts. Many had chosen his faith at sword point. It was the only option left. Others had rationalized their past atrocities by convincing themselves that Lorgar must be right, because the alternative, that they had murdered their family and friends for nothing, was unbearable. If Lorgar had noticed their fluctuating faith, he might have questioned whether coerced faith was genuine. Instead, he later used the same methods in the Great Crusade, converting planets at sword point, destroying cultures, and leaving the Imperium with a hollow religious void that was easily filled by chaos. Lorgar should have been able to see that guilt and trauma shape belief. Many of the Colchisians carried deep scars from the wars because absolutely everyone had lost someone close to them, even as they praised Lorgar as their prophet. Some tried justifying their actions, telling themselves that their violence was necessary. Others would have doubted but feared punishment or ostracization. There we go. If Lorgar had looked deeper, he would have realized that people don't just believe. They need to believe in order to cope. He might have seen how fear and trauma can drive people into extreme faith, which could have made him more compassionate, or at least more aware of the cost of zealotry. Instead, he became blind to how his actions broke people, and thus he failed to recognize that chaos was manipulating him the same way. Perhaps he might have been able to see that prophecy is a dangerous trap. Lorgar had locked himself in with his prophecy, sure, but he'd also locked in the population of his planet. His people were caught in a self-reinforcing cycle. The closer the deadline came, the more their fear of being wrong made them cling harder to belief. But that made it even worse if it ended up not being fulfilled. Some of them would have rationalized delays, but many of them would have become more desperate, maybe doubted Lorgar, even if they weren't willing to say it out loud. If Lorgar had recognized how prophecy traps both the leader and the followers, perhaps he might have been more cautious in the future. Instead, he fell into the exact same trap later with chaos, committing too far, too fast, until he reached a point where turning back was impossible. Had Lorgar tried to observe and understand the people around him at this time, he might have learned some lessons. He might have understood their human reactions and approached faith differently. Faith is something fluid and personal. It's not something that must or should be imposed. Perhaps he might have thus avoided becoming a zealot tyrant. Instead, he ignored the doubts that he saw in others. He doubled down on belief. When the emperor arrived, it was a vindication of everything that he had already decided. But then when the emperor later crushed him at Monarchia, Lorgar tripled down on belief, turning to chaos. Now, that is not to say that Lorgar learned nothing from the people of Colchis. I think that Lorgar did learn some things from his people from that time. During the Great Crusade, the word-bearers would spend much more time than any other legion on rebuilding and compliance efforts, which would be consistent with Lorgar understanding that the faith was built after battle rather than during the battle. However, the bigger lesson that Lorgar learned was that the fulfillment of his prophecy, the arrival of the emperor, transformed all those who had faith. Before, the people had been filled with doubt and fear and grief, terrified that the prophecy may not be fulfilled, and terrified that it may. After the people of Colchis were overcome with ecstatic religious rapture, relief, rejoicing, they launched into months-long apoplexies of worship, which the emperor did not like, but was not willing to stop because he needed Lorgar on his side. Lorgar knew it was not he who had transformed the world. Lorgar didn't do it. No. It was the people's faith. It was the faith of his people and the power of their god, the emperor. Lorgar witnessed a metamorphosis of faith, a transformation from fragile, desperate belief into unshakable conviction the moment the prophecy was fulfilled. This was the most formative spiritual experience of his life. The emperor's arrival did not merely confirm Lorgar's faith, it sanctified it. It proved in his mind that faith is not just belief, it's power. It reshapes reality. Lorgar learned that faith is forged in crisis and vindicated in revelation. Before the emperor's arrival, Colchis was full of anxiety, doubt, and performative devotion. People trying to convince themselves they believed because the alternative was too terrifying. After the emperor arrived, their faith was utterly transformed. They weren't just believers. They were zealots now, willing to die for their god. Lorgar internalized this pattern. Faith must be tested, must endure hardship, and must ultimately be rewarded with revelation. This shaped the way that the word-bearers spread the imperial truth. They conquered, yes, but they broke people down, made them question their old faiths, and then gave them the revelation of the new faiths, the new faith in the emperor. Lorgar understood that faith is built after battle, not during. On Colchis, faith did not reach its peak during the Schism Wars. It was after the prophecy was fulfilled when the emperor arrived. Thus, the word-bearers took their time on each compliance campaign. They didn't merely defeat people. They spent years constructing cathedrals, rewriting cultural narratives, and reshaping entire belief systems. The lesson Lorgar learned was that war wins territory, but faith wins souls. Faith is a personal thing, but Lorgar understood that it has force beyond the individual. He did not view himself as the primary agent of change. He saw faith as a transcendent force that moves through people and transforms them. He believed that it was the faith of the Colchisians that changed their world, not his own words or actions. This later led to his belief that the warp was a reflection of faith itself, that gods exist because people believe in them, and that belief can shape reality, which is almost true in 40K. It's a little more complicated than that. The Chaos Gods are more like vortexes in the warp, which pull parts of people's souls off of their souls and towards the vortex if they are similar enough to what's already in the vortex. Anyway, before the Emperor's arrival, many people had doubts, but once the prophecy was fulfilled, doubt was erased. This made Lorgar dangerously resistant to reevaluating his own beliefs. He had already been proven right once, so why should he ever doubt himself again? Later, this meant that when he received his next revelation, that the Emperor was not truly a god, he embraced this new revelation with the same certainty as before, thus leading him down the path to chaos. Lorgar learned from Colchis, but what he learned was not caution. He learned that faith was forged in crisis, that prophecies are self-justifying, that faith becomes mature in the peace following a battle, and that belief is a power unto itself. I always find myself interested in moments in the life of the Primarchs, which have some similarity with a moment in the life of the Emperor, as that may allow them to better understand their father, and it may allow us to better understand both the Primarchs and the Emperor. Let us consider such a thematic pairing. Lorgar announced to the people of Colchis that the Emperor would arrive within a year's time, And everyone just had to take it on faith that it was going to happen, because he had no proof. Similarly, the Emperor conquered Terra, and he had conquered large portions of the Sol system in the Unification Wars, while the system was still cut off from the rest of the galaxy due to the galaxy-wide warp storms of the Age of Strife. During the latter portion of the Unification Wars, he did not maintain his focus on those last pockets of resistance, but instead turned his attention to preparing for the Great Crusade with the creation of the Astartes and the expansion of the Armada Imperialis, the precursor to the Imperial Navy. This only made sense in light of the Emperor's prescient psychic knowledge that the warp storms afflicting the galaxy were not going to be a problem for much longer. His subordinates just had to believe him and take it on faith when he said that these storms, which had been raging for what? Thousands of years? Maybe 10,000 years since the end of the Dark Age of technology, would calm quite shortly. What understanding of the Emperor might Lorgar have gained had he studied his father's history from before they met each other, and thus learned of this moment in the Unification Wars? I feel that, had Lorgar been able to recognize this parallel between his own life and the Emperor's life, it might have given him profound insight into his father, perhaps even a path to understanding him in a way which his brothers could not. To restate it, the core similarity here is that they both had faith in a foreseen but unproven future. Both Lorgar and the Emperor acted on an unshakable certainty in the face of what must have seemed to everyone else like an impossible claim, because Lorgar and the Emperor each had psychic, prescient knowledge of the future. Lorgar's prophecy was that he declared to the people of Colchis that the Emperor would arrive within a year, despite having no material proof. His followers just had to take his word on it. The Emperor's prediction was that he was turning his attention to preparing for the Great Crusade, even while the galaxy-wide warp storms still raged, trusting that they would soon calm because he had foreseen it. His followers had to take his word that the isolation of Terra was temporary. Both figures expected others to trust their knowledge of the future despite the absence of evidence. Had Lorgar studied this period of the Unification Wars with an open mind, he might have realized a few key things about his father. The Emperor was not opposed to what we might call faith. He simply wanted faith in the right things. People mischaracterize the Emperor's stance on faith because of his intense anti-religiosity. The belief that the Emperor has no use for faith and rejects it outright is false. Here is a moment where the Emperor himself demands faith. He asks his followers on Terra to believe in him, to believe in his prediction of the future without tangible proof. He's not asking this as a religious figure. He's asking this as a secular tyrant. But it still requires faith. He's not just acting as someone who wants someone to believe him. I'll rephrase that. That's clunky wording. He wants his followers to not just believe him. He wants his followers to believe in him, to trust that he will lead them well. If the Emperor rejected faith entirely, why would he ask them to consider this broad vision of the future? And if faith is an inherently weak concept, why would he expect others to trust him without evidence? Thus, faith is not the problem for the Emperor, it's where one places it. The Emperor does not reject belief in something greater than oneself, he rejects superstition and magic. He wants faith in reason, in progress. He wants people to believe in himself, the Emperor, as being the secular leader who will bring humanity into the future. It's tough to say whether this would have impacted Lorgar's vision of the Emperor as a divine religious figure. But he might have understood that he and the Emperor were more alike than he realized. Lorgar spent much of the Great Crusade feeling misunderstood by his father, which is accurate. But had he studied the Emperor's history, he might have recognized a deep similarity between them. They each saw further than others could, though Lorgar did not understand the psychic nature of his visions. Each of them struggled with the burden of knowing deep down a truth that others could not immediately perceive, and being unable to present evidence for what they know to be true, while at the same time expecting and asking for trust and loyalty from subordinates based on their unique vision of the future, and asking them to take it on faith instead of being able to present evidence. This might have led Lorgar to a greater sense of kinship with his father. Instead of viewing the Emperor as a cold and distant god, he might have seen the Emperor as a fellow prophet, one who explicitly stated a secular message, but one whose goals he could serve in a way that still fulfilled his need for faith and purpose. Now, the big difference here was that when the Emperor made his prediction about the end of the warp storms, it was not divine revelation. It was psychic premonition. The Emperor was the most powerful psyker humanity had ever produced. He could perceive the fluctuations of the warp. His prediction was thus not religious prophecy, it was informed certainty, as much as the future can ever be informed. This is what separated him from Lorgar. He did not ask his followers for blind faith in a deity. He asked his followers to trust that he himself had rational belief in the order of the universe. He trusted himself and his own abilities, and he wanted his followers to believe in and trust in him his abilities the same way he trusted his own abilities. Sentence a little clunky, but I think you got it. Perhaps, had Lorgar understood this distinction, he might have understood that the Emperor's rejection of worship was not a rejection of himself as an object of adoration. It was a rejection of the idea that truth came from faith alone. Rather, truth comes from rational observation of the universe and from the warp. Faith is just trust when you yourself don't have the evidence that the person you're trusting does. Lorgar's downfall was in many ways a tragedy of misunderstanding. He never truly understood the Emperor's vision because the Emperor sure as shit was not going to explain himself. Everyone watching their interactions framed their conflict as one of faith versus rationality, when in reality it was about faith in revealed truth, the Emperor, versus faith in unknowable mystery, Lorgar. Had Lorgar looked at the Emperor's own personal history in the Unification Wars, perhaps he might have seen the lesson that the Emperor did not reject belief and faith. He rejected belief without reason. He was demanding trust, not worship. The Emperor and Lorgar were not so different, but they spoke different languages of conviction. And perhaps, had Lorgar come to understand this, had he understood that what the Emperor craved was for people to judge him, the Emperor, based on his abilities and his actions, maybe Lorgar might have found a way to express his adoration of the Emperor in a way that the Emperor would have accepted. Instead, he misunderstood his father, and he was misunderstood in turn because the Emperor sure was not going to tell Lorgar how he feels. But Lorgar might have been able to see it anyway by looking at his actions. His father might have been the very thing he was looking for if only he had seen it. Instead, He was blinded by preoccupation with his own visions. Okay, now we get to the big turning point. The Emperor meeting Lorgar. When the Emperor stepped foot on Colchis, he did not realize that he was in danger. He had encountered low-technology cultures on the planets of Primarchs before, and he had interacted with them on their cultural terms to win them over, especially Russ and Vulcan. The new kid wants to have the Emperor sit through interminable celebrations and displays of piety. Sure, he can put up with that and play along. The Emperor was restless and annoyed that it took a few months because he wanted to get back to the Great Crusade. But if that's the worst that Lorgar would put him through, then he could deal with it. That was not the worst that Lorgar would put him through. The Emperor had played the guest god before, sitting through feasts and trials of strength, waiting for his Primarch to come to his senses and accept his role. He expected that, in time, Lorgar would move past his religious pageantry and take up the secular role of the Imperium to focus on the true task ahead, war and conquest. The problem was the Emperor failed to grasp that this was not a performance for Lorgar. This was the culmination of Lorgar's entire existence. Everything Lorgar had done, his childhood heresies, his wars, his prophecy, the slaughter of a third of his world in 2 horrific religious civil wars, had been leading to this moment, meeting his God in the flesh. The Emperor was not just his father, the Emperor was his God, and a god must act like a god. The danger was not that Lorgar would attack the Emperor. The danger was that Lorgar was already interpreting and overinterpreting the Emperor's every word, every action, every hesitation, and drawing theological conclusions from it all. Lorgar had spent his entire life waiting for the divine moment when the one true God would reveal his will. And the Emperor, unaware, was writing scripture with every step he took. Corpheron immediately recognized the danger. He had spent years manipulating Lorgar's faith, subtly trying to steer him, keep him from going too far, keep him under control. But the moment the Emperor arrived, he lost all influence. He didn't regain his full influence over Lorgar until Monarchia. Imagine his horror. Corpheron had shaped a fanatic, and now the fanatic had met his god. I'm calm now. Corpheron could no longer redirect Lorgar's faith. It had a new source. If the Emperor had been savvier, if he had made any attempt to engage with Lorgar, to understand Lorgar, to make fucking small talk, he could have steered Lorgar, but the Emperor did not take his role seriously. He didn't even take the role of being a father seriously. He sure as shit was not going to be a god. Every time the Emperor dismissed a prayer or ignored a religious custom, Lorgar was watching and interpreting. Had the Emperor engaged with the idea that Lorgar thought of him as a god, even temporarily, he could have channeled Lorgar's fervor into something useful. He could have stepped down from the pedestal before it was too high. Instead, the cracks in Lorgar's faith began to form even then. When someone is put on a pedestal, they cannot live up to the expectations of others, and so they must inevitably fall. This is a natural consequence of being a fallible person who can't live up to a perfect idealization. There comes a moment in everyone's adolescence when they realize that their parents are just people, and the pedestal made during childhood crumbles. The authority of the parent is reduced as they come crashing down to earth. But afterwards, one can appreciate one's parents for who they are as people and build respect for them an appropriate amount, gaining a mature understanding that they are people who are doing their best. When someone is put up on the pedestal of godhood and that pedestal falls, they do not come crashing down to earth. Instead, they crash straight through down to hell. The object of religious devotion is hated by the former devotee because of just how high the expectations had been. I am not qualified to talk about religious trauma and the psychology of people who have left cults, but it is my hope that by engaging with the idea of Lorgar, we can learn more about that. This is the great danger that the Emperor did not appreciate. If it had not occurred at Monarchia, it would have happened at some other time and place. The pedestal would fall, and Lorgar would turn from the Emperor. The Emperor did not just fail to meet Lorgar's expectations, he never thought about what those expectations were. Deep breath. To the Emperor, this was just another Primarch. Another warlord to lead a legion. Another world to assimilate into the Imperium. Lorgar's piety was an eccentricity, something that might be indulged for a little while, then discarded as Lorgar becomes acclimated to the Imperium. But to Lorgar, this was apotheosis. The pedestal was too high. The belief was too deep. Disillusionment was inevitable. At first, Lorgar did not question. He studied the Emperor, searching for divine meaning in his actions. When the Emperor dismissed his worship, Lorgar did not react with anger. He assumed that he had misunderstood the divine will. The Emperor was silent on matters of faith, then divinity must be beyond words. The Emperor focused on conquest. War must be a sacred duty. The Emperor did not punish non-believers. Then perhaps salvation was not for all. Lorgar's primary thought, the foundation of the Lectitio Divinatus, I think I'm pronouncing that right, was that the Emperor's divinity was proven by his humble rejection of worship. These cracks could not be ignored forever. That massive contradiction accumulated damage. If the Emperor was divine, why did he reject the adoration of his people? You can't contort the truth to mean that rejection of faith proves that the faith is justified forever. If the Emperor was the one true God, why did he refuse to teach divine truth? If the Emperor had Lorgar as his prophet, why did he show no interest in prophecy? Lorgar's mind, trained in theology, could not stop asking questions. Monarchia was not the first disappointment. It was simply the final and undeniable proof that Lorgar's faith, that Lorgar's worship had been misplaced. Because Lorgar's faith had been total, so too became his hatred. He had been made a fool. He had killed for his god. He had burned worlds to the ground, drowned his legion in blood, sacrificed people in their billions, and it had all been a lie. The Emperor had never been a god. The Emperor had never even wanted to be a god. And in that moment, Lorgar was left without purpose, and in comes chaos. This is why his fall to chaos was inevitable once the pedestal crumbled. His need for faith was absolute. He would either find a new god or he would become one. Falling from the pedestal was not inevitably going to lead to Lorgar turning to chaos. No. But the Emperor needed to carefully climb down from the pedestal. I'll say that differently. There was only one way for the Emperor to help to meet Lorgar's emotional needs. He needed to meet him as a person, not a deity. In order to do that, he would have needed to resist being placed up on a pedestal, so as to limit its metaphorical height, and then carefully and cautiously climb down from the pedestal by speaking with Lorgar honestly about his struggles and his failures, demonstrating through words and deeds that he was a person doing his best. Falling in Lorgar's estimation was inevitable. Their relationship could have withstood the Emperor falling from the pedestal upon which a child places their parent, maybe even the pedestal upon which a congregation places a saint. But the Emperor's relationship with Lorgar could never be repaired after falling from presumed divinity. Lorgar's faith needed to be redirected into something sustainable, rather than being allowed to build and build and build and reach a height from which falling could only lead to catastrophe. In order to accomplish this, the Emperor would have required intentionality, patience, an interest in someone else's emotional needs. These are things he rarely demonstrates in personal relationships. The moment the Emperor realized Lorgar had built him up to the people of Colchis, had built him up in his own mind as a god, he needed to actively dismantle that belief. Not through scorn or punishment, and not solely through vocal denial, but rather through humility. Another thing the Emperor was bad at. Explicitly rejecting divinity was not enough. The Emperor needed to demonstrate his humanity to Lorgar through vulnerability and acknowledgement of his own flaws. And the Emperor was maybe the worst in the galaxy at both of those things. The Emperor should have recognized that Lorgar needed something to believe in, a cause greater than himself. He needed it more than air. Instead of giving Lorgar vague commands to stop worshipping and start conquering, he needed to explain his vision for humanity in a way that satisfied Lorgar's theological mind. Faith should not have been placed in the Emperor, but trust could be placed in the Emperor to some degree. And perhaps faith could be placed in humanity's potential and in the dream of a better future, like the Emperor had. Lorgar needed someone to believe in, if not the Emperor as a god, then perhaps the Emperor as a mentor, or even simply as a father who gave a shit. If the Emperor had sat with Lorgar, not as a ruler, but as a man, and shared even a fraction of his struggles from his millennia-long existence, his hopes, his burdens, his mistakes and regrets, Lorgar might have transferred his faith into loyalty, love, and purpose, rather than blind devotion. If the Emperor had gently deconstructed Lorgar's pedestal, rather than letting it build until it inevitably collapsed from a Tower of Babel-esque height, then the fall at Monarchia might not have been inevitable. Lorgar would still have struggled. He would have certainly still mourned the loss of his childhood faith, but he could have emerged from that stronger and more mature, rather than emotionally shattered and desperate for a new god. Instead of reacting by burning the Imperium, he might have become its greatest philosopher, the Primarch who ensured that the Imperium's ideals were something that people could actually believe in, The tragedy is that the Emperor was capable of all this. He was an unmatched psyker, the most powerful telepath in the galaxy, a master manipulator, and when he chose to, he could be incredibly charismatic. We even see him being compassionate sometimes with the Custodes. But he did not choose to, because to the Emperor, Lorgar was a tool. He was a machine to turn worlds into compliant worlds, and Lorgar's belief was irrelevant. And so he let himself be put on this pedestal he did not even realize existed until it was too late. Well, why did Lorgar think that the Emperor was a god? Well, the Emperor, a giant warrior with a flaming sword at the head of a gold-armored host, comes to Colchis, casually performing psychic feats of impossible, miraculous magnitude, then says with a straight face that he is not a god. It's no wonder Lorgar didn't believe him and worshipped him anyway. Let's compare this with the messianic secret of Jesus' early ministry in various passages of the synoptic gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Maybe we can see how Lorgar could have thought that the Emperor just didn't want to come out in public as a religious messiah because it was too early or whatnot. I feel that it would make sense for Lorgar, already predisposed towards religious devotion, would interpret the Emperor's denials in the same way that early Christians understood Jesus' reluctance to be openly called the Messiah early in his ministry. Okay, so what do we mean by messianic secret? Well, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus often commands his disciples and others to not tell people about what he's done, to not reveal his true identity. There are some key examples we should go over. In Mark 1:34, "And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him." That is to say, the demons recognized him as the Messiah, the Son of God, and he would not let them tell the people of Judea, "Hey, holy shit, this is the Messiah who's come to cast me out." No. Similarly then, in Mark 1:43-44, after healing a leper, Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone." In Luke 8:56, after raising a girl from the dead, her parents were amazed, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. Why did Jesus tell people that he healed, that he raised from the dead, not to spread the word? It wasn't time yet. He also tells the apostles the same thing. In Mark 8:29-30, Peter confesses, "You are the Messiah," and Jesus strictly charges him to tell no one about him. Now, scholars suggest a variety of reasons for this. Jesus may have wanted to avoid misinterpretations of his role. That is to say, several times throughout Jesus' first sojourn on earth, people tried to make him a political ruler, someone who would be the king of the earthly Israel and free them from Rome. But that's not the point of why he came here. He came to earth to save us from sin, not to save us from the Romans. He may have known that revealing himself too early would perhaps lead to his crucifixion before his full ministry had been taught. Or it may have been a test of faith for those who followed him. Or it may have just been that he was waiting for his Father's will, that he would reveal his true purpose as the Messiah. How does this apply to Lorgar and the Emperor? Well, Lorgar, deeply steeped in religious thinking and the possessor of many religious texts on Colchis, would have been familiar with at least some sort of familiar pattern in Colchisian theology. Yeah, they almost certainly did not have the Bible, but they would have had similar stories. Seeing the emperor deny his divinity would not have thus shattered his faith. It would have made him more convinced that the emperor had some sort of divine plan, Maybe the emperor's denials could be seen as a test. Since Lorgar already believed the emperor to be divine, then every time the emperor said, "I am not a god," Lorgar interprets this much the same way as scholars interpret Jesus telling his disciples to keep his secret. Lorgar thought, this is a ritual of faith. This is a trial. He wants me to believe even though he denies it. If Lorgar had read some Colchisian parallel to our biblical texts about Jesus, he would have known that maybe it's the nature of a Messiah to wait before revealing themselves to the world. Perhaps he believed that the emperor simply didn't want to announce his divinity yet, perhaps to avoid disrupting the Great Crusade's political and military structure with theological complications. Besides, the emperor's power and actions seemed to confirm his divinity no matter what he said with his words. The emperor performed psychic abilities beyond human understanding. Surely this was miraculous. He had arrived on Colchis exactly as Lorgar's visions had predicted, thus fulfilling Lorgar's religious prophecy. He conquered entire civilizations, wielded godlike power, and was apparently immortal. Lorgar would see all this and think, how could he not be divine? Besides which, Lorgar's need for faith overpowered any possibility of doubt. The people of Colchis went through extreme suffering before the emperor's arrival, and they needed to believe it had been worth it. Lorgar had led wars which resulted in killing a third of his planet's population because of his faith in the emperor. He was not going to throw that faith away just because the emperor said a few words. Faith does not require evidence. It survives despite evidence. The emperor, for his part, completely misunderstood how Lorgar's mind worked. He assumed that telling Lorgar, "I am not a god," was enough, because Lorgar seemed to respect him, and thus he expected that Lorgar would be obedient to him. But he never explained why he wanted Lorgar to believe he's not a god. He never gave Lorgar a coherent alternative framework for understanding his apparently godlike power. Instead of just denying his divinity, the emperor needed to actually engage with Lorgar and talk with him about important stuff. He likely needed to explain what chaos was and how the beings called gods actually worked in the warp. He needed to give Lorgar a new philosophical purpose, something within the imperial truth. He needed to have Magnus or Malkador probably sit down with Lorgar and educate him on psychic power and the warp, which of course means he first needed to realize that Lorgar was psychic. By simply rejecting the label of godhood without deeper discussion, the emperor left a vacuum, and that vacuum was inevitably filled by chaos. Much like early Christians interpreting Jesus' silence on matters of being the Messiah as a sign of deeper divinity, Lorgar's belief in the emperor only grew stronger when the emperor denied it. To Lorgar, this was a test, a moment where he had to prove his faith by believing even when the emperor said not to. No, believing because the emperor said not to. He twisted logic until he convinced himself, until he wrote Lectitio Divinatus and tried to convince everyone else that the emperor's divinity was proven by the emperor's denial of his divinity. The emperor was thus caught in a theological trap he never even noticed. By the time he started to understand that there was a problem, the fall at Monarchia was already inevitable. Thankfully, the emperor had some options available to him. Perhaps he could have transferred Lorgar's belief from himself to the imperial truth, or some version of it which they could both accept. Something that would satisfy Lorgar's need for meaning, while still aligning with the Imperium's goals. This wouldn't be exclusive to the option of humbling himself and explaining himself, but this option also would not have required the Emperor to show humility so much. It just needed a careful reinterpretation of faith. Unfortunately, the Emperor did not realize that he was in any danger at all throughout the several months he was on Colchis. A display of staggering oversight and willful ignorance matched only multiple other times in the Emperor's life. Look, Lorgar was not just a zealot, he was a theologian. He analyzed, structured, and codified belief systems. Had the Emperor guided him in crafting a doctrine of purpose for humanity, Lorgar would have become its greatest advocate rather than humanity's greatest heretic. If the Emperor could have emphasized how faith was not inherently bad and convinced Lorgar that faith needs to be placed in something real rather than some sort of ineffable mystery, then instead of worshipping a single embodied being, Lorgar might have been a preacher of the human spirit, the potential of mankind, the greatness of the unified humanity, which is pretty much the Emperor's belief, his reason for doing the Great Crusade. The Emperor could have given Lorgar a new vocabulary. Instead of being a god, the Emperor would be the guide of humanity. Instead of offering worship, people could revere the Imperium's ideals and strive to embody its virtues with their actions. The word-bearers could have become the philosopher warriors of the Imperium, rather than zealots. The imperial truth was kind of vague. Lorgar could have written the foundational philosophy of the imperial truth in a way that actually inspired people. Instead of just banning religion, the Imperium needed to offer something better in its place, or at least an alternative in its place. A belief in progress, knowledge, and the destiny of mankind, and it needed to have some sort of structure for it. The word-bearers would have become missionaries of enlightenment, trying to gain compliance through cultural transformation rather than brute force. Somehow, the Emperor did not even realize there was a danger. He spent months on Colchis and never saw what was unfolding around him. He failed to recognize the consequences of being worshipped. He failed to notice Lorgar's need for belief. He failed to engage with what was important to Lorgar, and so he failed to see that it was important for him to shape Lorgar's belief before it festered into something destructive. This moment is one of the greatest examples of the Emperor's negligence. He was brilliant, but he lacked the wisdom, the emotional maturity, the giving a shit, to understand people who were different from himself. Throughout his months on Colchis, he put in no effort to trying to understand Lorgar. And because he ignored the danger around him, Lorgar had to experience the most brutal, crushing version of disillusionment possible. He had to watch his god cast him down, humiliate him, and then leave him on his own to find a new god in the only place that would accept him, chaos. There are two pieces of great fortune, great luck, about the Emperor's position when he meets Lorgar on Colchis. First, he has the best opportunity of anyone to recognize Lorgar's potential for psychic power and to begin training him. I think that the Emperor not noticing the potential for Mortarion to display psychic power is understandable given the circumstances of their meeting. But with Lorgar, he was practically tripping over the evidence available to him. All it would have taken would be for Magnus, or the Emperor, who were both present, to ask Lorgar even a little bit about himself. The most important thing in Lorgar's life up to this point had been his visions, his premonitions about the emperor's arrival. So he would have certainly told him about the visions. When something's really important to someone, they bring it up in conversation all the fucking time. You should know this if you've had a coworker who's had a baby. Either the emperor or Magnus would have immediately picked up on these visions, likely being psychic in origin. The imperial expedition to Colchis included the most powerful and learned psychic individual in the Imperium, and also the second most powerful and learned psychic individual in the Imperium. But neither the Emperor nor Magnus, honestly, bothered to ask Lorgar anything at all about the most important thing to ever happen to him. The Emperor was there for months, bored out of his mind, and he never once thought to make small talk? It's absolutely baffling. The Emperor had months on Colchis. Magnus at least showed up, though I can't find evidence in canon about whether he was there for those months. And yet neither of them recognized or even investigated Lorgar's psychic potential. This wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a staggering failure to engage with the one thing that had defined Lorgar's entire life. Lorgar's visions were not subtle. They weren't minor hunches or vague intuitions. They were clear, powerful, prophetic, and repeated over and over in his adult life. He prophesied the Emperor's exact arrival with Magnus. His visions were strong enough that because of them, he completely upended Colchisian society. He'd staked his entire existence and the entire order of his world on them. These are not the characteristics of a mere dreamer. They're not delusions or hallucinations. They are classic signs of uncontrolled psychic ability. What should have happened? Well, the Emperor or Magnus should have asked Lorgar about his faith, not because they care about the religion, but because it's the most important thing to Lorgar. Understanding the origins of Lorgar's faith would give insight into his motivations and personality, which is important when you're meeting someone. You should care about the motivations and personality of your fucking family. Any conversation about this at all would have immediately revealed his visions. If the Emperor had simply asked, "Why do you believe I am a god?" Lorgar would have immediately explained, "Oh, I had these visions of you." Tell me about these visions, kid. They should have immediately identified the psychic nature of the visions as soon as they heard about them. They would have been able to examine Lorgar's mind and confirm, oh yeah, he had a psychic awakening. His visions are not just religious hallucinations. They are actual warp-based prophecy. And then Lorgar could have begun proper psychic training, probably with Magnus. Lorgar could have been given structure, control, understanding of his abilities on a scholarly level. He was the consummate scholar of the Primarchs, perhaps matched only by Magnus, the consummate psychic scholar of the Primarchs. Rather than being left adrift in spiritual fanaticism, Lorgar could have been taught how to use his power responsibly and safely. With the right training, Lorgar would have been a powerful and learned psyker. Instead, he received his training, such as it was, from the powers of chaos, which is bad. The most damning part of all of this is that the Emperor, at least, we know from canon, was on Colchis, stuck there with Lorgar, for months. He had months to figure this out, while being bored out of his mind. He sat through endless ceremonies and rituals. He felt trapped by the pageantry. He wanted to leave as soon as possible. And yet, despite all this time on his hands, he never bothered to actually talk to Lorgar, like a person, about what had made Lorgar who he was. This is a gigantic lack of curiosity, but more than that, it's a failure of leadership and, a complete absence of parenting. Meanwhile, Magnus was known for scouting and cultivating psychic talent. The moment he found Auriman, he started teaching and shaping him into a powerful sorcerer. If Magnus had been even slightly invested in Lorgar as his brother, he could have asked him about himself, found out about the visions, immediately clocked that he's psychic, and then turned him into a disciplined psyker rather than a lost prophet. But nobody bothered to ask. And because nobody asked, Lorgar's psychic potential remained untrained and vulnerable to corruption. Lorgar could have been a disciplined, imperial-trained, likely, trained by Magnus, psyker, rather than a desperate soul searching for meaning. He could have been a scholar of imperial philosophy, rather than a religious zealot, had they engaged with him on a scholarly level. He could have been a loyal son, rather than the architect of the Imperium's greatest betrayal, had the Emperor engaged with him as a father, or maybe even if Magnus had engaged with him as a brother, even in the face of the Emperor's complete lack of interest. Instead, they ignored the warning signs. And so Lorgar's psychic abilities, untamed, unchecked, had presented him with these visions, which ultimately led him straight into the arms of chaos because he had no ability to understand what he'd seen. I'm calm now. The second great opportunity at that time was for the Emperor to engage in a frank discussion about chaos, maybe with both Lorgar and Magnus, who each needed some sort of information about chaos. Colchizian society and theology had been tainted by chaos. The four great powers of the Covenant were merely the chaos gods in more benevolent guises, something which is not unique to Colchis. The Emperor obviously would have noticed right away. Having a pantheon of four divine figures with that combination of domains, it's obvious every time. They saw this in the Great Crusade pretty regularly. Lorgar had explicitly turned away from the worship of these four powers. Indeed, he had saved his entire planet and purged the most devout one-third of believers in this chaos-tainted polytheism without even realizing the full danger that the people of Colchis were in. The Emperor could have taken, any time at all to explain to Lorgar and Magnus the true danger that these four powers posed and why Lorgar had been right to halt their worship. If he had been willing to take Colchis as a very obvious hint that his strategy of ignorance had already failed Lorgar. The Emperor must have felt profound relief that he was not going to have to purge the population of his son's homeworld himself. He would have had the opportunity to feel pride in Lorgar for such a great accomplishment. However, this would still be like coming home to find out that your 10-year-old had dug up a landmine in your backyard and then disassembled it on your kitchen table. Good job on not blowing yourself up, but don't you ever do that again. Fuck, not to harp on it, but this is such a crucial missed opportunity. If the Emperor had been remotely engaged in Lorgar, if he had cared at all about what had happened in Lorgar's life up to that time, Colchis should have been a wake-up call. Instead, he ignored the warning signs, he failed to recognize Lorgar's dangerous trajectory, and he failed to understand the pressing need to educate him about chaos. The situation on Colchis screamed for an intervention. The Covenant was obviously a chaos-tainted religion. Lorgar had purged it without realizing what it was he was actually fighting. The entire planet had been a breeding ground for the worship of the four chaos powers, and Lorgar, with his innate psychic potential, had been shaped in this environment, risking corruption at all times without even knowing what forces had been at play. Any leader concerned with chaos should have immediately recognized that Lorgar was a dangerous outlier. He had cleansed chaos-tainted worship without knowledge, guidance, or safeguards. So that meant he had a strong will. Lorgar did what needed to be done, what the Emperor wanted to be done, without even understanding why it needed to be done. Lorgar was both vulnerable and resilient. Lorgar's spiritual void, left by the destruction of the old faith, was still aching to be filled, and his psychic power necessarily made him vulnerable to the whispers of the warp. But he had resisted all that so far. But the biggest lesson is simply this: if left unchecked, he would repeat the cycle. Without understanding what he had fought against, he would fall into another version of the same mistake later. This was the perfect moment for the Emperor to realize, oh shit, I gotta tell at least some of the Primarchs about chaos. Maybe step in, teach Lorgar and Magnus the dangers of chaos. I feel that the general rule he should have followed if he wanted to maintain some level of secrecy was that his Primarchs needed to be given information about the dangers they faced in proportion to their vulnerability to that specific danger. And when it came to chaos, he failed to understand or apply this rule at all. Let's talk about the conversation that should have happened. He should have sat Lorgar and Magnus down, given their shared interest in metaphysics, and spoken plainly. It was right to purge the Covenant, but you don't know why. What the people of Colchis called the Four Powers are real, but they are not gods, they are monsters. They are not divine, but they are real. They do actually exist in the warp, but they corrupt everything they touch. Many civilizations have fallen because humans mistook them for gods. Many more will yet fall. This is the reason why I ban religion. Religion is too easily co-opted into worship of these powers. Lorgar, your visions connect to them in some way, and that makes you vulnerable. You must be taught by Magnus to guard yourself. If you seek divinity, the horrible psychic parasites that you called the powers in Colchisian religion will answer you. Any sort of mature conversation about the dangers, a frank discussion of the risks he faced, would have completely altered Lorgar's path. It would have been able to channel his faith into something safer, more productive, would have taught him to guard against chaos. It would have given him purpose within the Great Crusade, rather than at odds with the Great Crusade. And even if Lorgar still ended up with a religious bent, he would have at least directed it in himself and in his legion away from the worship of the four powers of chaos. They would have spent the Great Crusade focused on purging worlds whose populations had been exposed to chaos corruption. They would have been the anti-chaos legion, probably also the Thousand Sons. But instead, his untrained psychic powers and his ignorance that the Emperor inflicted upon him unknowingly led Lorgar right back into the waiting arms of chaos. The Emperor generally thought that if he never mentioned chaos, he could prevent its spread. He refused to talk about chaos at all because he stubbornly and wrongly believed that people were most vulnerable to chaos if they knew about it. But at Colchis, that strategy had already failed. Lorgar had spent his entire life immersed in chaos-warped theology, and it was practically a miracle that he had not been corrupted already. He had purged a chaos-tainted faith, and he was looking to build another faith. Guess what's gonna corrupt it? He was a powerful latent psyker with no training or safeguards. Guess what he was vulnerable to? The fact that the Emperor did not course correct right then and there is one of his greatest mistakes, either first or second. Instead, he left Lorgar ignorant. He left Magnus ignorant. He let them stumble through the Great Crusade, lacking any sort of forewarning until the ruinous powers found them. To be forewarned is to be forearmed.